The October air carried a chill that seemed to seep through my jacket and settle deep in my bones as our car pulled into the church parking lot. Halloween night had arrived with an overcast sky that threatened rain, and the bare branches of the oak trees surrounding the property scratched against each other in the wind like skeletal fingers. I was 14 years old, and this would be my third year attending Hallelujah Night, the church's Christian alternative to Halloween that my parents insisted was wholesome fun compared to the devil's holiday. The parking lot buzzed with activity as families unloaded decorations, candy, and game supplies from their vehicles. Orange and black streamers fluttered from the church's exterior like warning flags, and carved pumpkins with flickering candles cast dancing shadows across the concrete. The familiar scent of autumn leaves mixed with the sweeter smell of caramel apples and cotton candy being prepared inside. Remember, we're here early to help set up, my mother reminded me as she gathered plastic tablecloths from the back seat. The Mitchell family is counting on us for the ring toss booth. I nodded, though my attention was already focused on the candy barrels being wheeled in through the main entrance. Being here early meant first access to the good stuff before the younger kids descended like locusts and picked through everything. My stomach rumbled in anticipation as I imagined pockets full of full-size candy bars and premium chocolates. The church building itself seemed different in the fading daylight. During regular Sunday services, it felt warm and inviting with sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. But now, with storm clouds gathering overhead and shadows pooling in every corner, the Gothic architecture took on a more ominous appearance. Chooky. The bell tower stretched up into the darkening sky like a pointing finger, and the carved stone faces around the doorways seemed to watch our every movement with hollow eyes. Inside, the fellowship hall had been transformed into a maze of game booths and activity stations. Volunteers rushed back and forth, their voices echoing off the high ceiling as they called out instructions and updates. Children's laughter mixed with the sound of hammering and the scrape of tables being dragged across the linoleum floor. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, casting brief moments of shadow that made my skin crawl. I spent the next hour helping my parents set up the ring toss booth, arranging plastic bottles into neat rows and testing the weight of the rings. The work was mindless and repetitive, allowing my thoughts to wander as I watched other families prepare their stations. Mrs. Peterson was setting up the cakewalk with numbered squares, her movements sharp and efficient. The Johnson family had claimed the fish pond game, complete with a blue tarp and plastic fish with prizes attached. As the afternoon wore on, the sky outside grew darker and the wind picked up enough to rattle the windows. The first drops of rain began pattering against the glass, creating irregular patterns that distorted the view of the parking lot. Each time lightning flashed in the distance, the stained glass windows would briefly illuminate with brilliant colors before fading back to their muted tones. "I think we're all set here," my father announced, wiping his hands on a towel. "Why don't you go explore while we finish up the last few details?" I didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing my PSP from my jacket pocket, I made my way through the fellowship hall and out toward the main sanctuary. The hallways were dimmer than usual, with only every other light fixture turned on to save electricity. My footsteps echoed strangely in the empty corridors, seeming to bounce back from directions that didn't make sense. The main sanctuary was nearly empty, just a few people adjusting decorations near the altar. I found my favorite bench near the back, positioned perfectly to see both the fellowship hall entrance and the large windows that faced west. This spot had always felt safe to me, a vantage point where I could observe everything while remaining relatively unnoticed. Outside, the sunset was beginning despite the storm clouds, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples that seemed to bleed through the gray. The contrast was beautiful but unsettling, like watching fire burn through smoke. I settled onto the wooden bench, feeling the familiar groove worn smooth by countless worshippers, and pulled out my PSP. The device's blue glow seemed brighter in the dim sanctuary as I scrolled through my music library. I had spent hours loading songs onto the memory card, everything from rock to classical to video game soundtracks. The familiar ritual of selecting the perfect music for my mood was comforting, a small pocket of normalcy in the strange atmosphere of the evening. The first notes of a haunting piano melody filled my earbuds, and I leaned back against the bench to watch the sunset through the tall windows. The music seemed to match the melancholy beauty of the scene, with minor chords that spoke of endings and transitions. Outside, the wind was picking up, sending leaves spiraling past the glass in chaotic patterns. That's when I noticed the footsteps. They were soft at first, barely audible over my music, but there was something deliberate about their rhythm that made me lower the volume. Someone was walking down the center aisle of the sanctuary, their shoes clicking against the marble floor with measured precision. I turned to look, expecting to see one of the pastors, or perhaps a volunteer making final preparations. Instead, I saw a man I didn't recognize. He was probably in his 30s with dark hair and an average build that made him seem unremarkable at first glance. But there was something about his presence that immediately captured my attention. He moved with a confidence that suggested familiarity with the space, yet I was certain I had never seen him before. His clothes were neat, but somehow timeless. A simple button-down shirt and dark pants that could have belonged to any decade. What struck me most was his expression. He was smiling, but it wasn't the polite surface-level smile I was used to seeing from church members. This smile seemed genuine, warm, as if he was genuinely pleased to see me sitting there. It was the kind of smile you'd expect from an old friend, someone who knew you well and was happy to encounter you unexpectedly. He approached my bench with that same measured pace, and I found myself pulling out my earbuds without conscious thought. There was something magnetic about his presence, a quality that demanded attention even though he hadn't said a word. "Beautiful evening for Hallelujah night," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that matched his smile. "Mind if I sit?" I nodded, sliding over to make room on the bench. And up close, I could see that his eyes were a pale blue, almost gray, and they seemed to hold depths that didn't match his apparent age. There were no lines around them, no signs of wear, yet they had the quality of someone who had seen far more than their years should allow. "I don't think we've met," I said, trying to place him among the regular congregation. "Are you visiting tonight?" He chuckled, a sound that seemed to echo strangely in the sanctuary despite the soft acoustics. "You could say that, though I've been coming to this church for years. Actually, there's something about this place that keeps drawing me back, especially on nights like this." The way he said it made me glance around the sanctuary, seeing it through his eyes. The shadows seemed deeper now, pooling between the pews and stretching across the floor, like reaching fingers. The stained glass windows had darkened as the sunset faded, turning them into abstract patterns of color that no longer depicted recognizable religious scenes. "There's an energy here," he continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Especially during events like this. When the barriers between worlds grow thin." I wasn't sure what he meant by that, but something in his tone made the hair on my arm stand up. The sanctuary felt colder suddenly, as if the heating system had shut off, though I could still hear the gentle hum of the ventilation. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to shake off the sudden unease. "I didn't catch your name." He turned to look at me directly, and for a moment, his pale eyes seemed to reflect the dim light like a cat's. "Names have power," he said quietly. "Sometimes it's better to leave certain things unnamed." The statement hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I couldn't quite grasp. Outside, the wind was howling now, rattling the windows with enough force to make the glass vibrate in its frames. The sound seemed to emphasize the isolation of our conversation, as if the storm was cutting us off from the rest of the world. "You seem like a thoughtful young man," he said, studying my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Tell me, have you ever noticed things that others don't? Seen shadows move when they shouldn't, heard voices when no one's speaking?" I shook my head, though even as I did, memories flickered through my mind. Times when I'd caught movement in my peripheral vision, only to turn and find nothing there. Moments when I'd heard my name called in empty rooms. Empty rooms. I had always dismissed these as imagination, the product of an overactive mind influenced by too many horror movies. "It's nothing to be ashamed of," he continued, as if reading my thoughts. "Some people are more sensitive to the things that exist alongside our world. The shadows that move independently, the voices that speak from empty air, the presences that watch from corners where no one should be standing." As he spoke, I found my gaze drawn to the corners of the sanctuary. The shadows there did seem unusually dense, as if darkness was pooling in those spaces despite the overhead lights. And was that movement I detected a subtle shifting that suggested something was hiding just out of sight? "But here's what I've learned," he said, leaning closer. His breath was cold against my ear, carrying a scent like old books and withered flowers. Curiosity killed the cat. As they say, there are some doors that should never be opened, some stones that should never be turned over. When you sense something watching from the darkness, the wisest thing you can do is look away. His words sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. There was something prophetic about the way he spoke, as if he was warning me about specific dangers rather than speaking in generalities. I wanted to ask him what he meant, what kinds of things he was talking about, but something in his expression discouraged questions. "You'll understand when you're older," he said, sitting back with that same enigmatic smile. "Some knowledge comes with a price, and wisdom often means knowing when to remain ignorant." I looked down at my PSP, still glowing in my hands, trying to process what he had told me. The screen showed my music library, the familiar song titles providing an anchor of normalcy in the increasingly surreal conversation. When I looked up again, ready to ask him to explain what he meant, I found myself staring at empty space. The bench beside me was vacant. I turned my head in every direction, eyes scanning the sanctuary for any sign of him. The space was exactly as it had been when I first arrived. A few people near the altar, shadows stretching between the pews, the storm continuing to rage outside the windows. But the man who had been sitting beside me, speaking in riddles about doors that shouldn't be opened and knowledge that came with a price, had simply vanished. Not walked away, vanished. I stood up quickly, my heart beginning to race as I searched the sanctuary more thoroughly. There was no way he could have left without me noticing. The center aisle stretched directly in front of me, yet he was gone, as completely as if he had never been there at all. The only evidence of our conversation was the lingering scent of old books and withered flowers, and even that was fading rapidly in the circulating air. I sat back down on the bench, my legs suddenly unsteady, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined the entire encounter? The conversation had felt absolutely real, every word clear and distinct. I could remember the texture of his voice, the pale color of his eyes, the way his breath had felt cold against my ear. But people didn't just disappear into thin air, especially not in the middle of a church sanctuary with multiple witnesses nearby. I looked toward the altar where the volunteers were still working, wondering if any of them had seen the man. They continued their tasks without paying any attention to me, discussing the placement of decorations and the timing of the evening's events. If they had witnessed anything unusual, they showed no signs of it. Outside, the storm was reaching its peak, with lightning flashing frequently enough to strobe the stained glass windows. Each burst of illumination revealed the empty sanctuary in stark detail, confirming that I was now alone in the space. The shadows that had seemed so alive during our conversation now appeared normal, merely the absence of light in predictable places. But his words echoed in my mind with a weight that suggested truth rather than delusion. The warning about curiosity, about doors that shouldn't be opened and stones that shouldn't be turned over. The implication that some people were more sensitive to things that existed alongside our world. As I sat there in the dim sanctuary, surrounded by the familiar symbols of faith and comfort, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed, that I had been marked in some way, chosen for a role I didn't understand, in a story I hadn't known I was part of. Munkens. The storm outside continued to rage, and somewhere in its howling wind, I thought I could hear the echo of his voice, still speaking in riddles about the dangers of curiosity and the price of knowledge. The weeks following Hallelujah night passed in a haze of normalcy that felt increasingly fragile. I returned to school, fell back into the routine of homework and tests and teenage social navigation, but the encounter with the mysterious man lingered in my mind like a splinter I couldn't dig out. Every time I tried to dismiss it as imagination or a dream, some detail would surface with crystalline clarity. The way his eyes had reflected light like glass, the cold touch of his breath, the absolute certainty in his voice when he warned me about curiosity. November brought an early frost that killed the last of the autumn flowers and left the trees bare and skeletal against the gray sky. The church grounds took on a desolate appearance, with brown grass crunching underfoot and the playground equipment standing empty, except for a few crows that gathered there in the afternoons. I found myself studying every face during Sunday services, searching for any sign of the man, but he never appeared. My parents had noticed my distraction, though they attributed it to typical teenage moodiness. Micah. When my mother asked if everything was all right, I considered telling her about the encounter, but something held me back. The man's words about curiosity and doors that shouldn't be opened felt like a warning meant specifically for me, not something to be shared and dissected by adults who would inevitably provide rational explanations. School became a refuge of sorts, with its predictable rhythms and concrete concerns. Math homework didn't vanish into thin air. Chemistry experiments followed logical rules. History unfolded in a sequence that made sense, because leading to effect in ways I could understand and memorize. But even there, I found myself noticing things I had previously overlooked, shadows that seemed too deep for the available light, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when I approached, the way certain hallways felt colder than others, without any apparent reason. The first week of December brought news that would change everything. It was a Tuesday evening when my mother called me down for dinner, her voice carrying an unusual note of sadness. I found my parents sitting at the kitchen table with untouched plates of food in front of them, their expressions somber in the yellow light of the overhead fixture. "What's wrong?" I asked, taking my usual seat and noting the way my father's hands were clasped tightly together. "There's been some sad news from the church," my mother said, her voice carefully controlled. "Do you remember the Henderson family? They used to attend regularly a few years ago." I shook my head. The name didn't ring any bells, though there were many families who had come and gone during my time at the church. "They had a son," my father continued, "about 10 years older than you. He left the area for college and never really came back to the community. But he'd been struggling with some personal issues in recent years." The way he said it made my stomach clench with premonition. I had heard that careful tone before, the one adults used when they were approaching a subject they found difficult to discuss. He passed away last week, my mother said quietly. It was sudden. The family has asked Pastor Williams to conduct the service, even though they haven't been regular attendees in some time. The food on my plate seemed to lose all appeal as I processed this information. Death was still an abstract concept to me at 14, something that happened to grandparents and characters in movies, not to real people in my actual community. The idea that someone who had once walked the same church halls I knew so well was simply gone felt impossible to fully comprehend. Impossible to fully comprehend. The funeral will be this Sunday, my father added. During the regular service time, Pastor Williams thought it would be meaningful to have the entire congregation there to support the family. I nodded, though my mind was already elsewhere. Something about the timing felt significant, though I couldn't articulate why. It had been exactly 6 weeks since Hallelujah Night, 6 weeks since my encounter with the mysterious man who had warned me about curiosity and the price of knowledge. The rest of the dinner passed in relative silence, with my parents discussing practical details about casseroles and flour arrangements, while I pushed food around my plate and tried to shake the feeling that something was approaching. Heinz is approaching. Some revelation that would change everything I thought I understood about the world. That night, I lay in bed listening to the wind rattle my bedroom windows and thinking about death. Not in a morbid way, but with the kind of clinical fascination that comes when an abstract concept suddenly becomes concrete. Someone who had breathed and laughed and worried about tests and relationships had simply stopped existing. Their thoughts had ended mid-sentence. Their plans had been abandoned, half-formed. Their future had collapsed into nothing. The darkness in my room seemed unusually thick, pooling in corners where my nightlight couldn't reach. Several times I thought I detected movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. Just shadows behaving as shadows should, static and predictable and utterly ordinary. But ordinary felt like a luxury I could no longer afford. Should no longer afford. The remaining days of the week crawled by with agonizing slowness. At school, I found myself studying my classmates' faces, wondering how many of them had ever encountered something they couldn't explain. How many had seen shadows move independently or heard voices from empty rooms? The man's words about sensitivity echoed in my mind, suggesting that these experiences weren't universal, that some people were simply more attuned to whatever existed alongside our normal world. Friday brought a snowstorm that blanketed the town in pristine white, transforming familiar landscapes into something alien and beautiful. The church parking lot was plowed clean for Sunday services, leaving high drifts around the perimeter that would persist for weeks. From my bedroom window, I could see the building's Gothic silhouette against the gray sky, its bell tower rising like a dark finger pointing toward heaven. Saturday night, I dreamed of the mysterious man. In the dream, I was back in the sanctuary on Hallelujah Night, but this time, the space was completely empty. No volunteers preparing decorations, no sounds of activity from the fellowship hall, just silence so complete it seemed to have weight. The stained glass windows showed nothing but darkness beyond, as if the outside world had simply ceased to exist. The man was sitting in the front pew, his back to me, perfectly still in a way that seemed almost inhuman. When I called out to him, he turned slowly, and I saw that his pale eyes had become completely white, like cataracts or fog. When he smiled, his teeth were too sharp, too numerous, filling his mouth in rows like a shark's. "I told you curiosity killed the cat," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the empty space, but I never mentioned what satisfaction brought back. I woke with a gasp. my heart hammering against my ribs and cold sweat dampening my pajamas. The digital clock beside my bed read 3:17 a.m., and outside my window, the snow continued to fall in thick, silent flakes. The dream had felt more real than memory, every detail etched with perfect clarity. I could still smell that mixture of old books and withered flowers, still feel the weight of his gaze even though his eyes had been solid white. Sleep didn't return that night. I lay in bed watching the snow accumulate on my windowsill and thinking about the funeral that was now only hours away. Something was building toward a revelation. I could feel it in the way the air seemed to thicken around me, in the way ordinary shadows seemed to watch and wait. Sunday morning arrived gray and cold, with new snow crunching under our feet as we walked from the parking lot to the church entrance. The building looked different somehow, more imposing than usual, with icicles hanging from the eaves like frozen tears. Inside, the sanctuary was fuller than normal, packed with people I didn't recognize alongside the regular congregation. The casket was positioned at the front of the church, a simple wooden box surrounded by flowers that seemed too bright and cheerful for the occasion. I took my usual place with my family in the middle section, but my attention kept drifting to the closed coffin and what it represented. Sin. Inside that box was someone who had once been alive, who had perhaps sat in these same pews and listened to these same hymns. Pastor Williams began the service with a reading from Ecclesiastes about there being a time for everything under heaven, including a time to be born and a time to die. His voice carried its usual warmth and authority, but I found it difficult to focus on his words. Instead, I was studying the faces of the mourners, looking for any sign of the mysterious man from Hallelujah Night. He wasn't there, at least not among the visible congregation, but something felt different about the sanctuary, as if the very air was charged with an energy I couldn't identify. The shadows between the pews seemed deeper than usual, and the stained glass windows appeared darker despite the white snow outside that should have been reflecting more light. It was during the reading of the obituary that everything changed. Pastor Williams had been speaking about the deceased man's life, his childhood in the community, his education, his struggles with personal demons that had ultimately led to his untimely death. The details washed over me without making much impression until the pastor mentioned that the young man had been particularly troubled by what he described as spiritual sensitivity, an inability to ignore what others couldn't see. The words hit me like a physical blow, so specific to my own recent experiences that I wondered if I had misheard. But Pastor Williams continued, describing how the deceased had reported seeing things that weren't there, hearing voices from empty rooms, feeling presences that couldn't be explained by normal means. His family asks that we remember him not as someone who lost his battle with mental illness, Pastor Williams said, his voice carrying a weight that suggested deeper knowledge, but as someone whose perception of reality was simply broader than most people can understand or accept. The sanctuary fell into a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Around me, the congregation sat motionless, but I felt as if I was the only person truly listening, the only one who understood the significance of what was being said. That's when Pastor Williams announced it was time to remember the deceased through photographs and video, and the lights dimmed as the large screens on either side of the sanctuary flickered to life. The first image appeared, and my world tilted sideways. It was him. The man from Hallelujah Night, perhaps a decade younger but unmistakably the same person, the same pale eyes, the same enigmatic smile, the same sense of depth and knowledge that seemed too great for his apparent age. He was standing in front of the very church where we now sat, wearing the same timeless clothing I remembered, looking directly into the camera as if he could see through the lens into this moment, this revelation. My vision began to tunnel, the edges of my sight going dark as the full implications crashed over me. I had spoken with a dead man, had sat beside someone who had been in the ground for a week when I encountered him on Halloween night, had received warnings about curiosity and knowledge from someone who had himself been driven to death by the very sensitivity he had described. The slideshow continued, showing more photos of the deceased at various ages, but I couldn't focus on anything except that first image. The impossible reality of what I had experienced was settling into my bones like poison, changing the fundamental nature of everything I thought I understood about the world. Around me, the congregation continued to sit in respectful silence, unaware that I was having a complete crisis of reality. My parents were focused on the screen, occasionally dabbing at their eyes with tissues, treating this as a normal funeral for someone they had known peripherally years before. But nothing about this was normal. Nothing about any of this followed the rules I had been taught about how the world worked. Inkta, the dead man, had specifically warned me about curiosity, about turning over stones that should be left alone. Had he been trying to protect me from exactly this kind of revelation? Or had he been preparing me for it, ensuring that when the truth finally surfaced, I would remember his warnings about the price of knowledge? The slideshow ended, and Pastor Williams began speaking about eternal rest and reunion with loved ones, but his words seemed to come from very far away. I was trapped in my own head, replaying every moment of that Halloween conversation, examining each detail for clues I had missed. The cold breath against my ear, the way his eyes had reflected light, the absolute certainty in his voice when he spoke about barriers between worlds growing thin. He had been trying to tell me something important, something specific about my own nature and the dangers that came with it. But I had been too young, too naive to understand the full implications of his warning. Now, sitting in a pew during his own funeral, I was beginning to comprehend the true scope of what I was dealing with. If the dead could speak to the living, if some people were sensitive enough to perceive things that existed alongside our normal world, then everything I thought I knew about reality was fundamentally incomplete. The service concluded with a hymn I didn't recognize, something about rest and peace and laying down burdens. As the congregation stood to sing, I remained seated, my legs too unsteady to support me. The voices around me blended into a sound like rushing water, and the sanctuary seemed to spin slowly around its axis. My mother noticed my condition and placed a cool hand on my forehead, her expression concerned. "Are you feeling all right?" she whispered. "You look very pale." I nodded weakly, not trusting my voice to remain steady. How could I explain that I had just discovered I was capable of speaking with the dead? How could I tell her that everything I thought I understood about the nature of reality had just been revealed as a comfortable lie? As the funeral concluded and people began filing out of the sanctuary, I caught glimpses of their faces, some tearful, others relieved that the service was over, most simply going through the motions of social obligation. None of them showed any sign of having experienced what I had just gone through. None of them appeared to be questioning the fundamental nature of existence, which meant that the dead man had been right about sensitivity being a rare trait, something that only certain people possessed. I was one of the unfortunate few who could perceive what others couldn't, who could hear voices from empty rooms and see shadows move independently. And if his warnings were accurate, this sensitivity came with a price I was only beginning to understand. The weeks following the funeral passed in a state of suspended reality. I went through the motions of normal teenage life. attending classes, completing homework, participating in family dinners, but everything felt hollow and insubstantial, like acting in a play where I was the only person who knew the script was fiction. The revelation that I had spoken with a dead man on Halloween night had fundamentally altered my perception of the world, leaving me feeling isolated in a way I had never experienced before. Sleep became elusive, and every night I would lie in bed, replaying the conversation with the mysterious man, examining each word for hidden meanings and warnings I had missed. His voice echoed in my mind with perfect clarity, that calm certainty when he spoke about barriers between worlds growing thin and the dangers of curiosity. Now I understood that he hadn't been speaking in metaphors. He had been trying to prepare me for a reality where the impossible was simply another facet of existence I had yet to encounter. At school, I found myself studying my classmates with new eyes, wondering if any of them had ever experienced something they couldn't explain. The hallways seemed different now, charged with an energy I was only beginning to perceive. Shadows lingered in corners where they shouldn't, and I caught glimpses of movement that stopped the moment I tried to focus on it. The dead man's words about some people being more sensitive than others took on new significance as I realized I was beginning to see things that had always been there, waiting for me to develop the ability to perceive them. Death? My parents noticed the change in my behavior, though they attributed it to typical adolescent moodiness. When my mother expressed concern about my appetite and sleep patterns, I managed to deflect her questions with vague complaints about school stress and seasonal depression. Seasonal depression. How could I explain that I was wrestling with the knowledge that reality was far more complicated and dangerous than anything they had taught me to expect? The church building itself had become a source of particular fascination and dread. During Sunday services, I would find myself scanning the congregation for any sign of other supernatural presences, studying faces for the telltale signs of depth and knowledge that had marked the dead man as different. The sanctuary felt charged with an energy I couldn't identify, as if the events of Halloween night and the funeral had awakened something that had been dormant in the sacred space. It was during one of these Sunday services, in the second week of January, that Pastor Williams made an announcement that would change everything once again. As many of you know, he said from the pulpit, his voice carrying the weight of careful consideration, our church has always been committed to serving the entire community, not just our regular congregation. Amen. That commitment sometimes means providing support during difficult times, even for families who haven't been part of our church family in recent years. The sanctuary was unusually quiet, with even the usual rustling of bulletins and shifting in pews reduced to a minimum. Where's the sign minimum? Something in the pastor's tone suggested that this announcement was more significant than the typical requests for volunteers or updates on church activities. The Henderson family has asked me to express their gratitude for the support this congregation showed during their recent loss. Pastor Williams continued. They were particularly moved by the turnout for the funeral service, and they wanted to share some information that might help us all understand the struggles their son faced during his final years. My attention sharpened immediately. Any mention of the dead man, whose name I had learned was Michael Henderson, sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the building's temperature. I leaned forward in the pew, ignoring my mother's curious glance. Michael had been documenting his experiences for several years before his death, Pastor Williams said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. He kept detailed journals describing what he called encounters with the other side, experiences that his family initially dismissed as symptoms of mental illness, but have since come to view as something far more complex. The silence in the sanctuary was now absolute. Even the children in the congregation seemed to sense the gravity of what was being discussed, sitting perfectly still in their parents' laps. I could feel my heartbeat accelerating as the implications of the pastor's words sank in. With the family's permission, I want to share one brief passage from Michael's writings, Pastor Williams continued, pulling a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. This entry was dated Halloween night, just a week before his death. The blood drained from my face so quickly I felt dizzy. Halloween night. The night I had encountered him in the sanctuary. The night he had warned me about curiosity and the price of knowledge. Pastor Williams unfolded the paper with deliberate care, his hands steady despite the weight of what he was about to reveal. The silence stretched until it felt like a physical presence in the room, pressing down on the congregation with suffocating intensity. Tonight I spoke with a young person at the church, Pastor Williams read, his voice barely audible in the vast space. Someone who doesn't yet understand what they're capable of perceiving. I tried to warn them about the dangers of the gift we share, but I fear my words were too cryptic, too wrapped in metaphor to convey the true urgency of the situation. My vision began to tunnel as the full implications crashed over me. He had written about our encounter, had documented the conversation from his perspective, leaving behind evidence that proved the impossible reality of what I had experienced. The barriers are thinning, Pastor Williams continued reading. The sensitive ones are beginning to notice things they've always been able to see, but have learned to ignore. This young person has that look of dawning awareness, the same expression I saw in my own mirror years ago, when I first accepted that the world contains more than most people can bear to acknowledge. The sanctuary was spinning slowly around its axis, or perhaps I was the one moving while everything else remained still. The stained glass windows seemed to pulse with their own light, and the shadows between the pews appeared to deepen with each word Pastor Williams spoke. I should have been more direct. But how do you tell a child that they're going to spend their life seeing dead people in grocery stores and hearing conversations from empty rooms? How do you explain that the sensitivity is both a gift and a curse, that it comes with responsibilities they never asked for, and dangers they can't imagine? My mother's hand found my arm, her grip tight with concern, as she noticed my pallor. But I couldn't respond to her touch, couldn't acknowledge her presence. I was trapped in the revelation that Michael Henderson had not only known about my sensitivity, but had been trying to protect me from the very knowledge that was now being shared with the entire congregation. If something happens to me, Pastor Williams read, his voice now thick with emotion, I hope they remember what I told them about curiosity and doors that shouldn't be opened. The other side is real, and it's not all peaceful reunions with deceased relatives. Some things that die don't rest quietly, and some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The journal entry ended there, but the silence that followed felt infinite. Around me, the congregation sat frozen in stunned contemplation of what they had just heard. Some faces showed skepticism, others fear, but most displayed the kind of careful blankness that people adopt when confronted with information that doesn't fit their understanding of how the world works. Pastor Williams folded the paper and returned it to his pocket, his movements deliberate and solemn. When he looked up at the congregation, his eyes seemed to scan the faces before him as if searching for someone specific. Michael's family wanted to share this because they believe there might be others in our community who have experienced similar things, he said. People who have felt isolated by perceptions that others dismiss as imagination or mental illness. Jai says they want those individuals to know that they're not alone, that their experiences are valid, and that this church will always be a place where they can find understanding and support. The words felt directed specifically at me, though I knew Pastor Williams couldn't possibly know about my encounter with Michael. Unless, had Michael mentioned me by name in his journals? Had he left behind more specific information about our Halloween night conversation? As the service continued with a hymn and closing prayers, I found myself unable to participate in the familiar rituals. My mind was racing through the implications of what I had just learned. Michael Henderson had possessed the same sensitivity I was developing, had spent years documenting encounters with what he called the other side, and had died knowing that there were others like him who would need guidance and warnings. The dead man's final words echoed in my memory with new weight. Some things that die don't rest quietly, and some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. He had been trying to prepare me for a future where my sensitivity would inevitably lead me into contact with forces I couldn't understand or control. After the service, as families gathered in the fellowship hall for coffee and conversation, I excused myself and walked to the main sanctuary. The space was empty now, except for the fading scent of candles and the lingering energy of collective prayer. I found my way to the bench where I had encountered Michael on Halloween night, settling into the same spot where he had delivered his cryptic warnings. The sanctuary felt different now, charged with an awareness that hadn't been there before. Or perhaps I was the one who had changed, my perception sharpened by the revelation that my encounter had been real and documented. The shadows between the pews seemed deeper, more substantial, as if they contained presences I was only beginning to learn how to detect. I pulled out my phone and stared at the blank screen, wondering if I should try to research Michael Henderson's death or seek out his family to learn more about his experiences. But even as the thought formed, I remembered his warnings about curiosity and doors that shouldn't be opened. Perhaps some knowledge was too dangerous to pursue, regardless of how much I wanted to understand what was happening to me. As I sat in the empty sanctuary, surrounded by the familiar symbols of faith and comfort, I realized that my childhood was effectively overchewed. The innocence that came with believing the world operated according to predictable rules had been stripped away, replaced by the terrible knowledge that reality contained layers of complexity I was only beginning to perceive. The dead could speak to the living. Some people were sensitive enough to hear them, and according to Michael Henderson's final warnings, not everything that existed on the other side was benevolent or peaceful. The gift that allowed me to perceive things others missed was also a curse that would isolate me from normal human experience. And somewhere in the darkness that surrounded everyday reality, things were stirring that knew I could see them. Michael Henderson had tried to warn me, but I was beginning to understand that some lessons could only be learned through direct experience. And the only question was whether I would be strong enough to survive what was coming, or whether I would eventually follow his path into a darkness too profound to escape. Outside the sanctuary windows, storm clouds were gathering once again, promising another night of wind and snow. But the real storm was building inside me, a growing awareness that would inevitably lead me into contact with forces that existed beyond the boundaries of normal human experience. The dead man's warnings echoed in my mind as I finally stood to leave the sanctuary. Curiosity killed the cat, but satisfaction brought it back. I was beginning to understand that some prices were too high to pay, but by then it might already be too late to turn back. February brought with it a bone-deep cold that seemed to seep through the church's stone walls and settle in the spaces between heartbeats. The heating system struggled against the Arctic air mass that had descended over our region, leaving the upper floors of the building perpetually chilly despite the constant hum of ancient radiators. It was during this particularly brutal stretch of winter that I began my volunteer work in the children's area, a commitment that would lead me directly into the heart of the darkness Michael Henderson had tried to warn me about. The decision to volunteer had been my mother's suggestion, presented as a way to get more involved in the church community and develop a sense of responsibility. In reality, I suspected it was her attempt to address what she perceived as my increasingly withdrawn behavior since the funeral. I had been spending more time alone, less interested in social activities, more prone to staring out windows with the kind of unfocused attention that worried parents. What she didn't understand was that I wasn't withdrawing from reality. Tia was finally beginning to see it clearly for the first time. I had completed my usual rounds, checking each classroom and finding them properly empty, turning off lights and ensuring windows were locked against the howling wind outside. The storm was severe enough that the building seemed to shake with each gust, and the lights flickered occasionally as power lines struggled against the weight of accumulated ice. The hallway stretched before me in its familiar pattern of alternating light and shadow, with the large window at the far end providing a view of the storm's fury. Snow was falling so heavily that the parking lot below was barely visible, just a vague impression of white punctuated by the occasional headlight as families hurried to their cars. I was walking toward the stairs, my weekly duties complete, when I caught a glimpse of movement near the elementary classroom door. A small head appeared briefly in the doorway, just for a second or two, before disappearing back into the room. The motion was quick enough that I almost convinced myself I had imagined it, but there had been something distinctly human about the shape and movement, too substantial to be a shadow, too purposeful to be a trick of light. My first thought was that one of the volunteers had missed a child during the escort process, and I felt a surge of responsibility mixed with mild panic. Leaving a child alone in the building was the kind of mistake that could result in serious consequences for both the church and the volunteer program. I quickened my pace toward the classroom, already planning how to reunite the child with their family before anyone realized the oversight had occurred. "Hello?" I called out as I approached the doorway, my voice echoing strangely in the empty hallway. "Is someone still in here?" Silence. I reached the classroom and peered inside, scanning the space systematically. The room was arranged exactly as I had left it just minutes before, chairs pushed neatly under tables, art supplies organized in their designated containers, the story corner with its carpet and cushions empty and undisturbed. The overhead lights were off, leaving the space illuminated only by the gray stormlight filtering through the windows. There was no child visible anywhere in the room. I stepped inside and conducted a more thorough search, checking behind the storage cabinets and under the tables where a frightened or playing child might hide. I called out again, using the gentle, reassuring tone I had heard volunteers employ when dealing with shy or upset children. "It's okay if you're hiding," I said, moving slowly through the room to avoid startling anyone who might be concealed. "I'm here to help you find your family. No one's in trouble." But the room was undeniably empty. I stood in the center of the space, trying to make sense of what I had seen. The head that appeared in the doorway had been at the height of a child, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, with dark hair and pale skin. The movement had been natural and human, lacking the jerky quality of shadows or the wavering nature of light reflections. Yet there was no child in the room, and no way for anyone to have left without passing me in the hallway. The rational explanations lined up in my mind like soldiers: stress-induced hallucinations, tricks of light and shadow, the psychological influence of recent supernatural experiences creating false perceptions. But underneath these comfortable lies, I could feel the truth settling into my bones like winter cold. I was seeing things that others couldn't. The sensitivity that Michael Henderson had warned me about was manifesting in new ways, showing me presences that existed in the spaces between normal perception. The child I had seen was real in some sense, but not in the way that living children were real. Children were real. As I stood in the empty classroom, surrounded by the innocent artifacts of childhood education, I remembered Michael's final journal entry about doors that couldn't be closed once opened. Whatever was happening to me was progressive, irreversible, leading me deeper into a reality where the boundaries between life and death were far more permeable than most people could imagine. I turned off the classroom lights and stepped back into the hallway, my weekly duties now genuinely complete. But as I walked toward the stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not malevolently, but with the kind of curious attention a child might pay to an interesting stranger. The large window at the end of the hallway served as my usual landmark, a source of natural light that made the space feel less claustrophobic. I had developed a habit of glancing toward it as I left each week, using the view of the outside world as a reminder that normal reality still existed beyond the confines of my increasingly strange experiences. But tonight, something was different. The window should have shown nothing but the storm, horizontal snow, swaying trees, the occasional glimpse of the parking lot below. Instead, I saw a figure standing there, silhouetted against the glass. It was a child, definitely the same one I had glimpsed in the classroom doorway. Now I could see more details. A young boy wearing what appeared to be old-fashioned clothing, with suspenders and a white shirt that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. He was standing perfectly still, facing the window as if watching the storm, but there was something unnatural about his posture, too rigid and motionless for a living child. I stopped walking, my breath catching in my throat as I stared down the hallway at the impossible figure. Every instinct told me to turn around and run, to flee down the stairs and out of the building without looking back. Michael Henderson's warnings about curiosity and doors that shouldn't be opened echoed in my mind. Velza. But stronger than fear was a strange sense of recognition, as if I had been waiting my entire life for this moment. The child at the window represented everything I was becoming, everything I was learning to perceive. He was proof that my experiences were real, that the sensitivity Michael had described was not a burden to be feared, but a truth to be accepted. I took a step forward, then another, drawn toward the figure despite every rational thought screaming at me to retreat. The hallway seemed to stretch longer than usual, as if the building itself was trying to prevent the encounter, but I continued walking, my footsteps echoing strangely in the silence until I was close enough to see more details. The child was definitely not alive in any conventional sense. His skin had a translucent quality that reminded me of old photographs, and his dark hair seemed to move despite the absence of any breeze. When he turned to look at me, his eyes held the same depth and knowledge I had seen in Michael Henderson's face, the look of someone who had experienced things beyond normal human understanding. "You can see me," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite being barely above a whisper. It was a statement rather than a question, spoken with the matter-of-fact tone children used when stating obvious truths. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. The reality of speaking with another supernatural presence was simultaneously terrifying and oddly comforting. At least I was no longer alone in whatever was happening to me. "Michael said you would," the child continued, his expression serious in the way that only children could achieve. "He said there would be others who could see us, especially in places like this, where the walls are thin." The mention of Michael Henderson sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the building's temperature. You knew him, the child nodded gravely. He helped me when I first arrived. Explained what had happened, why I couldn't find my family anymore. He said the living ones like you were special, that you could see both sides of the world. I glanced around the hallway. The shadows between the classroom doors seemed deeper now, more substantial, as if they contained additional watchers I couldn't yet perceive. Are there more of you? I asked, my voice barely audible. Many, the child replied simply. The church has been here for a long time. Some of us are from the old cemetery that used to be where the parking lot is now. Others are from different times, different places. But we all end up here eventually. The implications of what he was saying crashed over me like a physical weight. I was standing in a building that served as some kind of supernatural crossroads, a place where the dead gathered for reasons I couldn't begin to understand, and my sensitivity was allowing me to perceive what had been hidden from normal human awareness. Michael told me to be careful, I said, remembering the warnings about doors that shouldn't be opened. The child's expression grew even more serious. He was right to warn you. Not all of us are. Safe to talk to. Some have been here so long they've forgotten what they used to be. Others died angry and never learned to let go of that anger. As if summoned by his words, the temperature in the hallway dropped noticeably. My breath began to mist, and the fluorescent lights flickered with increasing frequency. The child's form became more distinct in the dimming light, while the shadows around us seemed to deepen and move with purposeful intent. You should go now, the child said urgently, his translucent features showing genuine concern. They know you can see them now. Some of them have been waiting for someone like you. The lights went out completely, plunging the hallway into darkness broken only by the stormlight filtering through the window. In that pale illumination, I could see shapes beginning to emerge from the shadows between the classroom doors, tall figures and short ones, indistinct forms that moved with the jerky, unnatural motion of things that no longer quite remembered how to be human. I ran. My feet pounded against the floor as I sprinted toward the stairs, no longer caring about maintaining the careful composure I had cultivated during previous supernatural encounters. Behind me, I could hear sounds that defied description. Whispers and moans, and something that might have been laughter, all blending together into a symphony of the damned. The staircase had never seemed so long, each step stretching endlessly before the next one appeared. The sounds behind me grew louder and more distinct, as if whatever inhabited the shadows was gaining confidence now that I had acknowledged their existence. I burst through the door at the bottom of the stairs and into the main sanctuary, where the familiar sight of stained glass windows and wooden pews provided an anchor to normal reality. Behind me, the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the frame, followed by absolute silence. One of the ushers was still in the sanctuary, organizing bulletins for the following week. He looked up at my dramatic entrance with mild concern, taking in my pale complexion and labored breathing. Everything all right up there? He asked, his tone suggesting he expected nothing more than a routine confirmation that all was well. Yes, I managed to say, though my voice shook with the effort. Just finished checking all the rooms. Everything's secure. He nodded and returned to his work, completely unaware that the upper floor of his church served as a gathering place for the dead, and that something fundamental had just shifted in the spiritual dynamics of the building. As I walked toward the main entrance, my legs still unsteady from the encounter, I realized that Michael Henderson's warnings had been more specific and urgent than I had understood. My sensitivity wasn't just developing, it was announcing itself to whatever supernatural presences existed in the area. By acknowledging the child at the window, By engaging in conversation with him, I had somehow crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. The dead knew I could see them now, and according to the child's warnings, not all of them were safe to encounter. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but the real tempest was just beginning to build inside me. I was no longer simply someone who occasionally glimpsed things others missed. I had become a beacon for supernatural attention, marked for encounters I couldn't predict or control. As I walked through the snow toward my family's car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, staying just out of sight, but close enough to remind me that my normal life was ending and something far more dangerous was beginning. The child's words echoed in my mind. Some of them have been waiting for someone like you. I was beginning to understand that waiting was over. The week following my encounter with the dead child passed in a haze of hypervigilance and barely contained terror. Every shadow seemed to pulse with potential movement. Every silence felt pregnant with whispered conversations just below the threshold of hearing. Sleep became impossible, not because of nightmares, but because of the absolute certainty that closing my eyes would leave me vulnerable to things that no longer needed to respect the boundaries between sleep and waking. At school, I found myself unable to concentrate on even the simplest tasks. During history class, I would catch glimpses of figures standing in corners that should have been empty. In the cafeteria, I heard fragments of conversations from tables where no one was sitting. The sensitivity that Michael Henderson had warned me about was no longer developing gradually. It was exploding outward like a dam that had finally burst under pressure. My parents' concern deepened as they watched me grow increasingly pale and withdrawn. When my mother suggested a visit to the family doctor, I managed to deflect her worry with complaints about stress and the approaching end of the school year. How could I explain that I was being stalked by supernatural forces that had marked me as someone who could perceive their presence? The most disturbing development was the growing awareness that I was being observed, not just occasionally during moments of supernatural encounter, but constantly. Something was watching me from the spaces between normal perception, studying my reactions and learning my patterns with the patience of a predator that had all the time in the world. Friday evening brought news that would force me back into direct contact with whatever was waiting for me in the church's upper floor. There's been a scheduling conflict for Sunday, my mother announced over dinner, consulting the church newsletter with a frown. Mrs. Patterson can't make it for the children's area cleanup, and they need someone to cover her shift. My stomach clenched with immediate dread. The thought of returning to the upper floor alone, knowing what I now knew about the supernatural presence that gathered there, filled me with a terror so profound it was almost physically painful. "I'm sure they can find someone else," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Lots of people volunteer for that kind of thing. Actually, Pastor Williams specifically asked if you would be available," my father added, looking up from his own copy of the newsletter. The irony was crushing. My diligence in checking each room thoroughly, my careful attention to security protocols, my reliable completion of assigned tasks, all of it had been motivated by a desire to avoid anything unusual or unexplained. Now that very competence was trapping me into another encounter with forces I couldn't understand or control. I suppose I could do it. I said weakly, already knowing that refusing would require explanations I couldn't provide. Sunday arrived gray and cold, with a persistent drizzle that turned the church parking lot into a maze of puddles and slick pavement. The weather seemed to match my mood as I sat through the morning service, barely listening to Pastor Williams' sermon about faith in times of uncertainty. Around me, families worshiped with a comfortable assurance that their greatest concerns involved mortgages and job security, and children's grades. None of them could see the figures that stood in the corners of the sanctuary, translucent forms that watched the proceedings with expressions ranging from wistful longing to something darker and more predatory. None of them noticed the way shadows moved independently of their sources, or heard the whispered conversations that provided a constant background to the hymns and prayers. I was alone in my awareness, isolated by a sensitivity that grew stronger with each passing day. Nanita. When the service ended and families began collecting their children from the upper floor, I lingered in the sanctuary until the building was nearly empty. The other volunteer had already confirmed that all children had been escorted downstairs, leaving me with my familiar routine of final security checks. But this time, I knew I wouldn't be alone during the process. The staircase to the upper floor seemed to stretch endlessly before me, each step requiring conscious effort, as if I was climbing through water or thick honey. The familiar sounds of the building, creaking wood, humming lights, the distant murmur of conversation from the fellowship hall, faded as I ascended, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to have weight. The hallway greeted me with its usual pattern of alternating light and shadow, but something had changed since my last visit. The shadows were deeper now, more substantial, as if darkness was pooling in the spaces between classroom doors like a viscous liquid. See? The fluorescent lights flickered erratically, casting unstable illumination that made everything appear to shift and move at the edges of vision. I began my rounds with the nursery, forcing myself to follow the established routine despite every instinct screaming at me to flee. The room was exactly as it should be, empty cribs arranged in neat rows, changing tables cleared of supplies, toys organized in their designated containers, but the silence felt expectant, as if the space was waiting for something to happen. The toddler room revealed no obvious anomalies, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from multiple directions simultaneously. The preschool area was similarly empty, but the story corner's carpet seemed to retain the impression of small bodies that were no longer physically present. It was in the elementary classroom that I first noticed the change in temperature. Fuzatana. The room was noticeably colder than the rest of the building, cold enough that my breath began to mist as I conducted my visual inspection. The windows were properly closed and locked, ruling out drafts from outside. The heating vents were functioning normally, circulating air that should have maintained consistent temperature throughout the floor. But the cold was different from anything I had experienced before, not the sharp bite of winter air or the damp chill of an unheated space, but something that seemed to emanate from within the room itself, as if the very molecules of air were being drained of warmth and energy. I moved through the space quickly, checking behind furniture and ensuring all supplies were properly stored. The cold intensified as I worked, until I could see my breath with each exhalation and feel the moisture beginning to freeze on my skin. By the time I reached for the light switch, my fingers were stiff with cold that defied natural explanation. The lights went out with a soft click, but instead of the expected darkness, the room remained partially illuminated by a pale glow that seemed to have no identifiable source. It was then that I noticed the figure standing near the art supplies cabinet. Another child, but different from the one I had encountered the previous week. This figure was taller, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, with light hair that seemed to move in a breeze that didn't exist. Like the younger child, this presence had the translucent quality of old photographs, but there was something more unsettling about its appearance. A wrongness that made my skin crawl even as I tried to understand what I was seeing. "You came back," the figure said, its voice carrying an odd echo that suggested vast empty spaces. "He said you would, but I wasn't sure. Most of the living ones run away after they see us the first time." I found my voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. afraid. Who said I would come back? The child figure tilted its head with a motion that was almost human but somehow off, like a badly calibrated mechanical toy. The tall one, the one who stands in the deep shadows where even we don't like to go. A chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature ran down my spine. The dead child from the previous week had warned me that not all of the supernatural presences were safe to encounter, and this figure's words suggested something far more dangerous than the innocent spirits I had met so far. Where is he? I asked, though part of me desperately didn't want to know the answer. The child figure pointed toward the hallway, its arm moving with the jerky motion of a marionette. At the window. He's been waiting there since you left last week, waiting and watching and growing stronger. I turned toward the classroom door, and my blood froze in my veins. The hallway beyond was no longer empty. Figures stood between the classroom doors, dozens of them, in various states of transparency and decay. Children and adults, some wearing modern clothing while others appeared to be from different historical periods. All of them were facing toward the large window at the end of the hall, where something massive and dark had positioned itself against the glass. The glass. The presence at the window was unlike anything I had encountered before. Where the dead children retained recognizable human characteristics despite their supernatural nature, it stood easily 8 feet tall, with a vaguely humanoid outline that shifted and flowed like smoke-given substance. But it was the way it moved that truly terrified me. As I watched from the classroom doorway, the dark mass began to shift position, sliding across the window with a fluid motion that defied physics. It wasn't walking or floating. It was flowing, like a liquid shadow that had learned to maintain coherence. And as it moved, the light from outside began to dim, as if the entity was somehow absorbing the illumination and converting it into more darkness. The fluorescent lights in the hallway flickered and died one by one as the presence moved past them, leaving an expanding pool of absolute blackness that swallowed everything in its path. The assembled spirits stepped back from its approach, their translucent forms showing signs of fear that suggested even the dead could be threatened by whatever this thing was. "It feeds on light," the child figure beside me whispered, its voice now tinged with terror. It's terror. "And on the living ones who can see us. It's been growing stronger since you started coming here, feeding off your sensitivity." The implications crashed over me like physical blows. My developing ability to perceive supernatural phenomena wasn't just allowing me to see the dead. It was somehow nourishing something far more dangerous. Every visit to the upper floor, every acknowledgement of supernatural presence had been feeding this entity and increasing its power. Michael Henderson's warnings about doors that couldn't be closed once opened took on new and terrifying significance. By accepting my sensitivity, by engaging with supernatural presences, I had inadvertently opened myself as a conduit for something that existed in the spaces between life and death. The dark mass had nearly reached the center of the hallway now, and the temperature was dropping so rapidly that frost was beginning to form on the windows. The assembled spirits were retreating toward the staircase, but their movements were sluggish, as if the entity's presence was draining their ability to maintain coherence. I knew I should run, should follow the other spirits down the stairs and out of the building before whatever was approaching decided to focus its attention on me. But I was paralyzed by the terrible beauty of what I was witnessing, the way darkness could move like living liquid. The way light could be consumed and transformed into something that negated existence itself. The entity stopped directly in front of the window where I had first encountered the dead child, and for a moment, it remained motionless. Then slowly, it began to turn toward the classroom, where I stood frozen in the doorway. As it turned, I caught a glimpse of what might have been a face. theme and features that seemed to draw in everything around it like a black hole made of malevolence. Where I should have been, there were only deeper pools of darkness that seemed to extend infinitely inward. When those non-eyes focused on me, I felt something fundamental tear inside my mind. The entity had found me. It began moving down the hallway with purpose now, no longer the aimless drifting of a predator, searching for prey, but the directed approach of something that had identified its target. The darkness around it expanded with each movement, swallowing the fluorescent lights and leaving an advancing wall of absolute nothingness in its wake. The remaining spirits fled toward the staircase, their forms becoming more transparent as they retreated from the entity's influence. Within seconds, I was alone on the upper floor with something that existed solely to consume light and life and the sensitivity that connected them. Every rational thought screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to obey. The entity's presence was doing something to the air itself, making it thick and viscous, difficult to breathe or move through. Each step it took toward my position sent waves of negation through the space, erasing not just light, but the very possibility of light. It was perhaps 20 feet away when I finally managed to break free from the paralysis that had claimed me. I turned and ran toward the staircase, my feet pounding against the floor with a rhythm that seemed impossibly loud in this supernatural silence. Behind me, I could hear something that might have been breathing, if breathing could be defined as the sound of reality itself being inhaled and destroyed. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, as if the building itself was conspiring to prevent my escape. The staircase that should have been just 30 feet from the classroom door seemed to recede with each step I took, always just out of reach. It was gaining ground despite my desperate sprint, moving through space in ways that normal physics couldn't explain. The darkness it carried was expanding to fill the entire hallway, swallowing the walls and ceiling until I was running through a tunnel of absolute nothingness. Just when I thought the staircase would never appear, I reached the door and threw myself through it with enough force to send me tumbling down the first few steps. Behind me, something that sounded like the death of stars slammed against the door, but the barrier held. The barrier held. I picked myself up and continued down the stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs and my breath coming in ragged gasps that burned my throat. The main sanctuary felt impossibly bright after the consuming darkness of the upper floor, and the familiar sight of stained glass windows and wooden pews provided an anchor to sanity that I desperately needed. One of the ushers was still arranging hymnals in the back pews, and he looked up at my dramatic entrance with the same mild concern I had received the week before. Finished up there? He asked, apparently noticing nothing unusual about my appearance or the terror that was surely written across my face. Yes, I managed to say, though my voice shook with more than just exertion. Everything's secure. As I walked toward the main entrance, my legs still unsteady from the encounter, I realized that something fundamental had changed. The entity on the upper floor wasn't just another supernatural presence. It was something that had been feeding off my sensitivity, growing stronger with each acknowledgement of the supernatural world. Michael Henderson's final warnings took on new urgency. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. By accepting my ability to see the dead, I had made myself visible to things that existed in the spaces between life and death. And at least one of those things had decided I was worth hunting. As I stepped out into the gray afternoon, I couldn't shake the feeling that the entity was still watching me, still feeding off my awareness of its existence. The sensitivity that had seemed like a gift was revealing itself as a curse that would mark me for attention from forces I couldn't understand or escape. The dead child's words echoed in my mind. Some of them have been waiting for someone like you. Now I understood that the waiting was over, and the real horror was just beginning. Hover existed in the darkness between worlds had found me, and I was beginning to suspect that running away was no longer an option. The shadow that devoured light knew where I lived now, and it was patient enough to wait for the perfect moment to complete whatever it had started in the church's upper floor. My childhood was over. My normal life was ending. And something vast and hungry and utterly alien had marked me as its next meal. The only question was whether I would find a way to survive what was coming in, or whether I would join the ranks of the dead who haunted the spaces between worlds, forever warning others about curiosity and the doors that should never be opened. In the gray afternoon light, surrounded by the comfortable illusion of normal reality, I realized that some prices were too high to pay, but by then, the bill had already come due. I should have known something was wrong the moment I saw the rental price. $200 a month for an entire house in the Australian outback seemed too good to be true, but desperation has a way of making even the most suspicious deals look appealing. After losing my job in Perth and burning through my savings, I was willing to take any accommodation I could get while I figured out my next move. The listing had been sparse on details. Remote property in historic Blackstone, Western Australia, ideal for writer's retreat or those seeking solitude. Fully furnished, long-term rental preferred. The attached photos showed a weathered but sturdy-looking weatherboard house with corrugated iron roofing, surrounded by the characteristic red dirt and sparse vegetation of the Goldfields region. Blackstone, I discovered through a quick online search, was one of Western Australia's many ghost towns. Once a thriving mining settlement in the early 1900s, it had been abandoned when the gold ran out in the 1960s. According to the limited information I could find, only a handful of buildings remained standing, most of the population having relocated to nearby Calgary or disappeared into other forgotten corners of the state. The real estate agent, a harried-sounding woman named Sandra, had been oddly eager to close the deal over the phone. When I mentioned I was interested in the Blackstone property, there was a strange pause before she launched into what sounded like a rehearsed speech about the unique character of the property and the unparalleled peace and quiet of the location. "You'll be the only resident in town," she'd said, and something in her tone made it sound less like a selling point and more like a warning. "The nearest neighbor is about 40 kilometers away. Are you sure you're comfortable with that level of isolation?" I assured her I was. Looking back now, as I write this by the flickering light of an oil lamp with my hands still trembling, I realize how catastrophically wrong I was. The drive to Blackstone took me 6 hours from Perth, the last two on increasingly rough dirt roads that seemed to lead nowhere. Seemed to lead nowhere. I passed the occasional abandoned homestead or rusted machinery, stark reminders of dreams that had withered under the relentless outback sun. The landscape grew more desolate with each kilometer, until it felt like I was driving toward the end of the world. I reached the town, if you could call it that, just as the sun was setting, painting the sky a deep crimson that made the scattered ruins look like they were bleeding. Blackstone consisted of perhaps a dozen structures in various states of decay. A collapsing general store with its roof caved in, the skeletal remains of what might have been a pub, a small stone church with its windows long since shattered, and scattered houses in different stages of surrender to time and weather. My rental house stood at the end of what had once been the main street, looking remarkably well preserved compared to its neighbors. It was a simple weatherboard cottage painted white, though the paint was peeling in long strips that fluttered in the evening breeze like dead skin. A wraparound veranda gave it a welcoming appearance that was somehow undermined by the dark windows that seemed to watch my approach. I parked my car next to the front gate and took my first real look at the place I'd committed to calling home for the next 6 months. The yard was overgrown with desert shrubs and dotted with the bleached bones of some long dead animal. A windmill in the backyard creaked ominously in the breeze, its metal blades casting moving shadows across the house. The front door was unlocked, as Sandra had promised. Inside, the house was fully furnished in a style that seemed frozen in the 1960s. Heavy wooden furniture, faded floral wallpaper, and appliances that looked like museum pieces. A generator hummed somewhere behind the house, providing electricity, while a large water tank outside suggested that modern conveniences were limited but functional. The house had 3 bedrooms, a compact kitchen, a sitting room with a stone fireplace, and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Despite the dated decor, everything was remarkably clean, as if someone had been maintaining the property right up until my arrival. That first night, I ate a simple dinner of canned soup and crackers, then tried to settle in for the evening. The silence was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. In Perth, there had always been some background noise, traffic, neighbors, the hum of air conditioning. Here, the quiet was so complete it seemed to have weight, pressing down on me until I found myself holding my breath just to break the spell. I brought books and my laptop, planning to spend my time in Blackstone working on the novel I'd always promised myself I'd write. But as I sat in the sitting room that first evening, surrounded by furniture that had probably been old when the town was still alive, I found it impossible to concentrate. Every small sound seemed amplified. The settling of the house, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the distant howl of what I assumed was a dingo. Around midnight, I gave up any pretense of productivity and headed to bed. The master bedroom was at the front of the house, with windows overlooking the main street and the ruins beyond. As I was closing the curtains, I noticed something that made me pause. There was a light in one of the ruined buildings across the street. It was faint, just a soft glow visible through what remained of a window in the old general store. My rational mind immediately supplied explanations, reflection from my own house lights, a piece of glass catching moonlight, maybe even another person who decided to explore the ghost town. But something about that light felt wrong, too steady to be a reflection, too dim to be artificial. I watched for several minutes, but the light didn't move or change. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, exhaustion playing tricks on me after the long drive. I closed the curtains firmly and went to bed, though it took hours to fall asleep. The last thing I remembered before finally drifting off was the sound of footsteps on the veranda outside my window, slow, deliberate steps that circled the house twice before fading into the night. I woke to find that someone had been inside my house. The realization came gradually as I stumbled through my morning routine. First, it was the coffee mug I'd left on the kitchen counter, now sitting in the sink, clean and dry. Then I noticed that the book I'd been reading was no longer on the coffee table where I'd left it, but sitting neatly on the bookshelf with the others, bookmarked exactly where I'd stopped reading. Each discovery sent a fresh chill down my spine. I searched the house methodically, looking for signs of forced entry, but found nothing. All the windows were still latched from the inside, the doors locked just as I'd left them. It was as if someone had simply materialized inside the house, tidied up after me, and vanished. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe I'd put the items away myself in my exhausted state the night before. Maybe the real estate company had sent someone to check on the property. But deep down, I knew neither explanation felt right. explanation felt right. The sensation of being watched had started almost immediately after discovering the disturbed items. It followed me as I made breakfast, a crawling feeling between my shoulder blades that made me constantly check over my shoulder. When I stepped onto the veranda to get some air, the feeling intensified until I was certain that someone, or something, was observing me from the ruins across the street. I decided to explore the town, partly to satisfy my curiosity, and partly to prove to myself that there was nothing supernatural about my new home. Armed with a bottle of water and my phone, which had no signal this far from civilization, I set out to investigate the remains of Blackstone. The old general store was my first stop, mainly because of the strange light I'd seen the night before. The building was in worse condition up close than it had appeared from my window. The roof had collapsed entirely, leaving the interior open to the elements. Weeds grew through cracks in the floor, and the walls were stained with decades of rust and weather damage. But it was when I stepped inside that I found the first real evidence that something was wrong in Blackstone. In the back corner of the store, protected from the worst of the weather by a partially intact wall, someone had arranged a collection of objects in what could only be described as a shrine. Old photographs, yellowed and water damaged, were propped against pieces of broken pottery. Flowers, actual fresh flowers, impossible in this desert wasteland, had been placed in a circle around the display. The photographs showed people I assumed were former residents of Blackstone, miners with dirt-stained faces, families posed in front of houses I could still see crumbling outside, children playing in streets that were now empty expanses of red dirt and scattered debris. But it was one photograph in particular that made my blood run cold. It showed a young woman, probably in her 20s, with dark hair and striking eyes. She was standing in front of the very house I was now renting, but the house in the photograph looked newer, the paint fresh and the yard well maintained. At the bottom of the photograph, someone had written a name in fading ink, Elisa. The flowers around the shrine were roses, deep red and so fresh they might have been picked that morning. In the middle of the Australian desert, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest garden, someone had placed fresh roses around a memorial to a woman named Elisa. I backed away from the shrine, my heart pounding. The rational part of my mind tried to supply explanations. Maybe someone from one of the nearby stations visited regularly to maintain the memorial. Maybe the flowers were artificial and just looked fresh. But my hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone to take a picture, only to discover that the camera function had mysteriously stopped working. The rest of my exploration of Blackstone was equally unsettling. In the ruins of the pub, I found more evidence of recent activity. Empty bottles arranged in neat rows on what remained of the bar, as if someone had been playing some elaborate game of solitaire with glass instead of cards. The small church contained wooden pews that had been carefully arranged to face a wall instead of the altar, as if the congregation had turned their backs on God. But it was in the cemetery behind the church that I made the discovery that sent me running back to my house. And now, the graveyard was small, perhaps 24 headstones marking the final resting places of Blackstone's former residents. Many of the markers were weathered beyond reading, their inscriptions lost to decades of desert wind and sun. But one grave stood out from the others, not because it was better preserved, but because it was clearly tended. The headstone was made of white marble that seemed to glow in the afternoon sun. Unlike the others, this marker was clean, free of the dust and grime that coated everything else in the abandoned town. Fresh flowers, the same deep red roses I'd seen in the shrine, were arranged at its base. The inscription was perfectly legible. Alyssa Margaret Thornton, 1943, 1967. Beloved daughter and eternal guardian of Blackstone. Below the dates, someone had carved a more recent edition in rough letters. She's waiting for you. I ran. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran from that cemetery like a child fleeing monsters in the dark. I didn't stop until I reached my house and had locked the door behind me, though I realized with a sick feeling that locks hadn't kept my mysterious visitor out the night before. That evening, I tried to convince myself that what I'd seen had rational explanations. Alyssa Thornton had died in 1967, the same year the town was abandoned. Someone, perhaps a relative, perhaps a local historian, was maintaining her grave and the shrine in her memory. The message about waiting for me was probably decades old, meant for some previous visitor to the town. But as I prepared dinner in the increasingly oppressive atmosphere of the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being prepared for something. Every shadow seemed to move with purpose. Every creak of the settling house sounded like footsteps. And when I looked out the kitchen window, I could swear I saw a figure standing in the cemetery, motionless among the headstones. I didn't sleep at all that second night. Instead, I sat in the sitting room with every light in the house turned on, watching the windows and listening to the sounds of something moving around outside. Footsteps circled the house repeatedly, always just outside my field of vision. Sometimes they stopped directly outside a window, and I could sense something standing there watching me through the glass. Around 3 in the morning, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sounds had been. For nearly an hour, I sat frozen in my chair, waiting for something to happen, and then, just as I was beginning to think the mysterious visitor had finally left, I heard the sound of the front door opening. The lock turned with a soft click. The door swung open on hinges that didn't make a sound. And then, with careful, deliberate steps, someone began walking through my house. She was beautiful in the way that ghosts always are in stories, ethereal, timeless, with an otherworldly quality that made her seem more like a memory than a person. But the woman standing in my sitting room doorway was very clearly solid, very clearly real, and very clearly not alive. Alyssa Thornton looked exactly as she had in the photograph, frozen at the age of 24 for more than 50 years. Her dark hair fell in waves around her shoulders, and her dress, a simple blue cotton sundress that might have been fashionable in the 1960s, moved gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. It was her eyes that gave her away as something other than human. They held depths that no living person's eyes should contain, depths filled with decades of loneliness and something that might have been rage. "You came," she said, and her voice was exactly what I'd expected a ghost's voice to sound like. Soft, distant, like an echo heard through water. I've been waiting so long for someone to come. I couldn't speak. Every rational thought I'd ever had abandoned me in that moment, leaving me sitting frozen in my chair, like prey paralyzed by a predator's gaze. This couldn't be happening. Ghosts weren't real. Weren't real. Dead people didn't walk into your living room and start conversations, but Alyssa was very clearly there, as real as the furniture around her, and she was speaking to me with the casual tone of someone who'd been expecting me for years. "You're wondering if you're going mad," she continued, moving into the room with gliding steps that never quite seemed to touch the floor. I remember that feeling, the disbelief, the desperate search for rational explanations. "But you're not crazy, and this isn't a dream." "I'm very real, just not in the way you understand reality." I finally managed to find my voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "You're dead," she smiled, and the expression was both beautiful and terrible. Death is a relative concept in Blackstone. This town exists between worlds now, and those of us who belong to it in life are bound to it in death. I've been the guardian here for 57 years, waiting for someone who could see me, someone I could talk to. Guardian of what? Ah, The words came out stronger this time, though my hands were still gripping the arms of my chair so tightly my knuckles had gone white. The memories of the stories, of the truth about what happened here. Alyssa moved to the window and looked out at the ruins of her town. Blackstone didn't just die when the gold ran out. It was murdered, and the murderer was never brought to justice. I wanted to run, wanted to bolt from the house and drive back to Perth and never think about this place again. But something in her voice, some note of desperate longing, kept me frozen in place. What happened? She turned back to me, and I saw tears on her cheeks, actual tears that caught the lamplight like diamonds. I was engaged to be married to a man named Thomas Hartwell. He was the mine supervisor, well respected in the community, trusted by everyone. But Thomas had a secret. He'd been embezzling from the mine company for years, skimming gold and selling it privately. When the mine started to fail and an audit was ordered, he knew he'd be discovered. The ghost began to pace, her movements agitated. He decided to cover his tracks by destroying the evidence and anyone who might have known about his activities. On the night of October 13th, 1967, Thomas poisoned the well that supplied water to the entire town. The cold I'd been feeling intensified until I was shivering. Despite the warm night air, he killed everyone. Not everyone died immediately, Alyssa said. Some fled when people started getting sick. Others died slowly over days. But I was among the first to go because I'd discovered what he was doing. He gave me an extra dose of the poison in my evening tea right here in this house. This was our house, you see. We were to be married the following month. I looked around the sitting room with new horror. The furniture I'd been living among for 2 days belonged to a woman who'd been murdered in this very room. Why didn't anyone investigate? Surely when an entire town died, who was left to tell the truth? Her voice became bitter. Thomas made sure all the records were destroyed. Destroyed. He told the authorities that the mine had failed and the town had dispersed naturally. The few survivors who might have known what really happened were too sick to contradict him, and most died within weeks. The official story was that Blackstone was just another failed mining town, abandoned when the gold ran out. And Thomas took his stolen gold and started a new life somewhere else. Changed his name, probably. Got away with murdering an entire community. An entire community? The ghost's eyes blazed with an intensity that made me shrink back in my chair. But some of us couldn't rest. Some of us were bound to this place by the injustice of it all, forced to watch over our empty town while our killer lived free somewhere in the world. The weight of her story settled over me like a physical presence. How many others? How many ghosts are here? 17 of us remain, she said. The others, teenany, show some spirits after enough time passes. They become something else, something dangerous. I've managed to maintain my sanity by focusing on my purpose, waiting for someone who could help me find justice. But that was over 50 years ago. Thomas would be dead by now anyway. Alyssa's smile was sharp as a blade. Thomas Hartwell died 3 years ago in a nursing home in Adelaide. 91 years old, surrounded by a loving family who never knew what their patriarch had done. He died peacefully in his sleep, having never faced consequences for his crimes. Then it's over. Justice might have been delayed, but the word came out with such force that the windows rattled. Death doesn't erase murder. The dead of Blackstone deserve to have their story told, their killer exposed for what he was. And Thomas's family deserves to know the truth about the man they mourned. I was beginning to understand why Alyssa had been waiting for someone like me. You want me to investigate, to find proof. I want you to tell our story, she said. You're a writer, aren't you? I can sense it in you, the desire to uncover truth and share it with the world. That's why you were drawn here, why you were able to see me when others couldn't. You're meant to be the voice for those who can no longer speak. The rational part of my mind was screaming that this was insane, that I was probably having some kind of breakdown brought on by isolation and stress. But looking at Alyssa, seeing the desperate hope in her spectral eyes, I found myself nodding. Where would I even start? It was 50 years ago. All the records are destroyed. Not all of them, she said. Thomas was careful, but he wasn't perfect. There are still pieces of evidence hidden in this house, things he missed in his rush to escape. And I've spent decades learning things that no living person could know, gathering secrets that only the dead can discover. She moved toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. Let me show you where Thomas hid his real records. Let me show you the proof that Blackstone was murdered. As I followed her deeper into the house, I had no idea that I was about to discover something far worse than a decades-old murder. I had no idea that Thomas Hartwell's crimes were just the beginning of a horror that stretched back generations. And I had no idea that by agreeing to help Alyssa, I had just signed my own death warrant. The hidden room was behind a false wall in what had been Thomas Hartwell's study. What had been Thomas Hartwell's study? Alyssa showed me how to press on a particular section of the wooden paneling, and it swung inward to reveal a narrow space barely large enough for a person to stand in. Inside, protected by the dry desert air, were boxes of documents that should have been destroyed half a century ago. He was too proud of his cleverness to destroy everything, Alyssa explained as I pulled out ledgers filled with falsified entries and correspondence detailing the systematic theft of gold from the mine. Some part of him wanted to keep proof of how brilliantly he'd fooled everyone. The evidence was damning and comprehensive. Letters to black market gold dealers, detailed records of embezzled funds, even a partially completed confession that Thomas had apparently written and then thought better of. But it was the final box that contained the most chilling discovery. This can't be right, I said, staring at a collection of newspaper clippings dating back to the 1890s. These are about other towns, other mines. Alyssa's expression had grown grim. Thomas wasn't the first. What happened to Blackstone wasn't unique. It was part of a pattern. The clippings told a horrifying story. Mining town after mining town throughout Western Australia had suffered mysterious disasters over the decades. Sometimes it was contaminated water, sometimes a mine collapse that killed everyone underground, sometimes simply the sudden disappearance of entire populations. The official explanations varied. Accidents, natural disasters, economic failures, but the pattern was unmistakable. How many? I whispered. We've counted at least 15 towns over 70 years, said a new voice from behind me. I spun around to find that we were no longer alone in the hidden room. 3 more figures had appeared, 2 men and a woman, all with the same ethereal quality as Alyssa, all clearly from different time periods based on their clothing. This is Henry Blackwood, Alyssa said, indicating a man in miner's clothes who looked like he'd stepped out of a daguerreotype from the 1890s. He was the first to discover what was happening. They've survived this long by being very good at making problems disappear. Are you saying they'd kill me? I'm saying they'd try, she replied. And unlike us, you don't have the protection of already being dead. The weight of the situation settled over me like a suffocating blanket. 300 innocent people were going to die unless someone stopped David Thornfield, and I was apparently the only living person who knew about it. But attempting to expose him would almost certainly result in my own death. There is another option, Henry said quietly. Something we've been discussing among ourselves for decades. What kind of option? The ghosts exchanged another look, and I realized that whatever they were about to propose, it was something they'd been planning for a very long time. The Hartwell family's power comes from their secrecy. Alyssa explained. They've never faced consequences because no one has ever been able to expose them. But what if we could change that? What if we could ensure that their crimes were revealed no matter what happened to you? How? By making you one of us, she said simply. The room seemed to grow colder, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. You're talking about killing me. We're talking about transforming you, Henry corrected. Death in Blackstone isn't the end. It's a change of state. You'd become like us, bound to this place but with abilities the living don't possess. You could travel as spirit to any location, gather evidence no living person could access, communicate with other spirits across the country. And you'd be safe from the Hartwell family's retribution, Sarah added. Dead people are very difficult to murder. The proposal was insane, impossible, and yet, as I looked around at the 4 ghosts surrounding me, I realized they were completely serious. They were offering to kill me in order to save 300 lives. Think about it, Alyssa said. You could expose not just David Thornfield, but the entire family legacy. You could give voice to thousands of victims who have been silenced for over a century. You could ensure that the truth finally comes to light. But I'd be dead. You'd be transformed, she corrected. Still yourself, still conscious, still able to think and feel and act. Just different. I stared at the evidence scattered around the hidden room, thought about the 300 people in Cooper's Ridge who had no idea what was coming for them, and felt the weight of an impossible decision settling on my shoulders. How long do I have to decide? Until tomorrow night, Alyssa said. Until tomorrow night, Alyssa said. David Thornfield is accelerating his timeline. If we're going to stop him, it has to be soon. As the ghosts faded away, leaving me alone with the evidence of a century of murder, I realized that my choice wasn't really about whether to live or die. It was about whether to let 300 innocent people die while I remained safely among the living, or to join the ranks of the dead in order to give them a chance at life. Well, I spent the day reading through every document in the hidden room, committing names and dates and details to memory. The scope of the Hartwell family's crimes was staggering. Not just the murdered towns, but the systematic corruption of officials, the careful cultivation of false identities, the meticulous planning that went into each mass killing. Thomas Hartwell's confession, the one he'd never finished, contained the most chilling details. He wrote about the family tradition with pride, describing how his grandfather had first discovered that the easiest way to cover up embezzlement was to eliminate all witnesses. Each generation had refined the methods, faster-acting poisons, better ways to destroy evidence, more sophisticated techniques for avoiding suspicion. The final entry in his journal was dated October 12, 1967, the day before he poisoned Blackstone's water supply. In neat handwriting, he'd written, "Tomorrow I join the ranks of the family's great successes. Alyssa suspects something, but she won't be a problem much longer. Soon I'll be free to start fresh somewhere else, carrying on the tradition for future generations." Reading those words in the house where Alyssa had died, surrounded by the furniture she'd chosen for her wedding, I felt a rage building inside me that was almost physical in its intensity. Thomas Hartwell had murdered the woman he claimed to love, along with an entire community, and had felt nothing but pride in carrying on his family's legacy of death. As evening approached, the other ghosts began to appear. Not just the 4 I'd met the night before, but all 17 of the spirits who remained bound to Blackstone. They materialized throughout the house like living memories, each one representing a life cut short by Thomas Hartwell's greed. There was Margaret Chen, who'd run the town's general store and had been excited about Alyssa's upcoming wedding. Peter Kowalski, the school teacher who'd been planning to expand the little schoolhouse to accommodate the growing number of children in town. Emma Davis, barely 18, who'd been saving money to attend nursing school in Perth. Each ghost had a story, a life that had been stolen from them, dreams that had died with their physical bodies, but each had also found a purpose in death, watching over their ruined town and waiting for justice. We know what we're asking of you, said Father McKenna, who'd been Blackstone's priest, to give up your life before it's truly begun, to join us in this strange existence between worlds. It's not a decision anyone should have to make. But those people in Cooper's Ridge, added Mrs. Patterson, who'd been the town's midwife, they don't deserve to die for David Thornfield's greed any more than we did. I walked out onto the veranda as the sun set over the ruins of Blackstone, painting the sky the same deep red it'd been when I'd first arrived. 3 days ago, I'd been a struggling writer looking for a quiet place to work on my novel, Now I was contemplating allowing myself to be murdered by ghosts in order to stop a serial killer I'd never met. The rational part of my mind kept insisting that this was all impossible, that I was having some kind of breakdown, that ghosts and century-old murder conspiracies existed only in fiction. But the evidence was undeniable. The spirits were undeniably real, and somewhere in Queensland, 300 people were going about their daily lives unaware that they were living on borrowed time. I'll do it, I said aloud to the evening air. I'll help you. Alyssa appeared beside me on the veranda, her ghostly form more solid and real-looking than I'd ever seen her. Are you certain? Once it's done, there's no going back. I'm certain. And surprisingly, I was. The fear was still there, but it was overwhelmed by a sense of rightness, of purpose I'd never felt before. How does it work? Said softly. Poison in your evening tea. It's quick. You'll simply go to sleep and not wake up. But instead of passing on to whatever comes after death, you'll remain here, bound to Blackstone and to us. And then we teach you how to exist as we do, how to travel as spirit, how to gather information, how to interact with the living world in subtle ways. It will take time to master, but you'll learn. That night, we held what could only be described as a wake. The ghosts shared stories of their lives in Blackstone, painting a picture of a vibrant community that had thrived in the harsh outback environment. They'd been miners and shopkeepers, teachers and bartenders, mothers and fathers and children with bright futures ahead of them. They also shared their experiences in death, the disorientation of finding themselves still conscious after their bodies had failed, the gradual realization that they were bound to the place where they died, the slow development of abilities that living humans didn't possess. Didn't possess. The hardest part, admitted Samuel Wright, who'd been the town's blacksmith, is watching the world change while being unable to participate in it. We've seen decades pass, watched technology advance, observed history unfold, but always as observers, never as participants. Until now, Elissa added, with you helping us, we can finally become participants again. We can finally act to prevent more deaths. As midnight approached, she prepared the tea with the same poison that had killed her 57 years earlier. The liquid was clear and odorless, indistinguishable from ordinary tea except for a slight bitter aftertaste. Any last words? She asked, though her tone was gentle rather than mocking. Just thank you for trusting me with this, and for giving me a chance to do something that matters. I drank the tea in 3 quick swallows, then settled back in the chair where I'd first seen Alyssa 2 nights earlier. The poison worked quickly. Within minutes, I could feel my heart slowing, my breathing becoming shallow. The world began to fade around the edges, and I closed my eyes as consciousness slipped away. But death, I discovered, wasn't an ending. It was a transformation. I opened my eyes to find myself standing in the same sitting room. But everything looked different. Colors were more vivid, sounds were clearer, and I could sense things that had been invisible to my living senses. The ghosts around me no longer seemed ethereal. They looked as solid and real as I had when I was alive. When I was alive. Welcome to the other side, Alyssa said, and I realized I could hear emotions in her voice that had been muted before. Relief, joy, hope. How do you feel? I took inventory of my new state of being. I felt lighter, as if gravity had less hold on me, but also more connected to everything around me. I could sense the history embedded in the walls of the house, could feel the pain and love and fear that had soaked into the very foundations over the decades. Different, I said. Still myself, but still myself. That's the most important thing, Father McKenna said. Some spirits lose themselves in the transition, become something else entirely. But you've retained your identity, your memories, your purpose. Over the following hours, they began to teach me how to exist as a ghost. How to move through solid objects, how to become visible or invisible to living humans at will, how to travel instantly to distant locations simply by focusing my intention. Most importantly, they taught me how to interact with the physical world in subtle ways, moving objects, influencing electronic devices, leaving messages for the living. The key is understanding that consciousness creates reality. Alyssa explained as we practiced in the ruins of the town. As living humans, you were limited by physical laws. As spirits, those limitations are more flexible. By dawn, I was ready for my first mission. David Thornfield was in his office in Cooper's Ridge, unaware that he was being watched by a dead man who had traveled 3,000 kilometers in an instant. Through abilities I was still learning to control, I accessed his computer files, his personal correspondence, his carefully hidden financial records. The evidence I gathered was even more damning than what we'd found in Thomas's hidden room. David had been embezzling from 3 different mining operations simultaneously, and his timeline for eliminating the evidence was even more accelerated than we'd feared. According to his private notes, he planned to poison Cooper's Ridge's water supply in less than 48 hours. Some 48 hours. But unlike his grandfather, David had made a crucial mistake. In his arrogance, he'd been careless with digital communications, sending encrypted messages to contacts who were clearly part of his support network. With my new abilities, I was able to trace those communications, identify his accomplices, and gather evidence that would expose not just David, but the entire network that had enabled the Hartwell family's crimes for generations. For generations. The challenge now was getting that evidence to the living authorities in a way they would accept and act upon quickly enough to save Cooper's Ridge. That's where the other ghosts proved invaluable. Margaret Chen had learned to manipulate telephone systems, allowing us to make anonymous calls to police departments. Peter Kowalski could influence computer systems, ensuring that our evidence would appear in the right digital folders for investigators to find. Emma Davis had mastered the art of appearing in dreams, allowing us to communicate directly with key individuals who were in positions to help. Within 24 hours, we had orchestrated a coordinated release of evidence to police departments in 3 states, mining industry regulators, and investigative journalists. The story of the Hartwell family murders began spreading across the country, and law enforcement agencies launched simultaneous raids on David Thornfield's operations. He was arrested 12 hours before he planned to poison Cooper's Ridge. But our work wasn't finished. Over the following weeks, we continued gathering evidence, identifying other members of the Hartwell network, ensuring that the full scope of their crimes was exposed. The story became national news, then international, as the world learned about Australia's hidden genocide. Fratricide. The people of Cooper's Ridge erected a memorial to the victims of the Hartwell murders, including all the ghost towns that had been erased from history. Families of the murderers' victims finally learned the truth about what had happened to their ancestors. And slowly, Justice began to catch up with crimes that had been hidden for over a century. As for me, I found a purpose in death that I'd never had in life. Along with the other spirits of Blackstone, I became a guardian against similar atrocities, watching for patterns of corruption and murder, ready to act when innocent lives were threatened. The living world moved on, as it always does, but we remained, 17 ghosts and 1 volunteer, bound together by tragedy, but united in purpose. We had become the voice for those who could no longer speak, the guardians of truth in a world where truth was often the first casualty of greed and ambition. And in the end, that was enough. In the end, it was everything. I should have known something was wrong when Carlos quoted me a price that was too good to be true. £200 for the month, he'd said over the phone, his accent thick with what I later learned was a mix of Spanish and something else I couldn't. Beautiful cottage, very private, perfect for writer, yes. I was desperate. My London flat had become unaffordable after I'd lost my job at the marketing firm, and I needed somewhere cheap to finish my novel. The cottage was listed as being near Ashford, which seemed reasonable enough. What Carlos hadn't mentioned was that it sat in complete isolation on the outskirts of Pluckley, a village I'd never heard of until I'd driven through it that gray October afternoon. Pluckley looked like something from a postcard, all Tudor timber and cottage gardens. The locals at the village shop seemed friendly enough when I'd stopped for supplies, though I noticed how their conversations died when I mentioned where I was staying. "Oh, you're renting from Carlos," the elderly shopkeeper had said, her smile fading slightly. "That's the old Whitmore place, isn't it? Been empty for years before he took it on. Is there something wrong with it?" I'd asked, but she'd already turned away, busying herself with rearranging the newspapers. The cottage itself was about 2 miles outside the village, down a narrow lane that seemed to close in on itself as you drove. Ancient oaks lined the path, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even in daylight it felt like dusk. When I finally pulled up to the property, I had to admit it was beautiful. A traditional Kentish cottage with exposed beams and diamond-paned windows, surrounded by overgrown gardens that spoke of years of neglect. Carlos was waiting for me, leaning against an old Ford Transit van. He was younger than I'd expected from his voice, maybe mid-30s, with dark hair and intense eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. When he smiled, I noticed his teeth were slightly too white, too perfect. "You found it okay," he said, though it sounded more like a statement than a question. "Good. Very good. Come, let me show you around." The interior was surprisingly well maintained. The ground floor had a cozy sitting room with an enormous stone fireplace, a small kitchen with modern appliances, and a dining room that looked out over the back garden. There were 2 bedrooms and a bathroom with an old clawfoot tub that looked original to the house. "Previous tenants, they didn't stay long," Carlos said as we toured the upstairs. "But you're a writer." "Writers, they understand atmosphere, yes? They appreciate history. There was something in the way he said history that made me pause. But I was already calculating how much money I'd save living here versus anywhere closer to London. "It's perfect," I said. "When can I move in?" And I move in. Carlos handed me the keys immediately. 2 heavy brass keys that looked far older than they should have been for a rental property. "Tonight, if you like. I'll leave you my number, but probably best not to call unless it's emergency." "To what kind of emergency?" He was already walking towards his van. "Oh, you know. Pipes bursting, power going out." He paused with his hand on the driver's door. "Other things." I wanted to ask what he meant by other things, but he was already pulling away, leaving me standing in the doorway with my suitcase and a growing sense that I'd missed something important in our conversation. The first few days were blissful. The isolation was exactly what I needed to focus on my writing, and I made more progress on my novel than I had in months. The cottage had an old-world charm that felt inspiring rather than oppressive. During the day, I could see why Carlos had described it as perfect for a writer. It was only at night that things felt different. The cottage was old, and old houses make noise. I knew that. The settling of ancient timbers, the whisper of wind through gaps in the window frames, the occasional creak of floorboards adjusting to changes in temperature. Normal sounds. But by the fourth night, I was starting to recognize that some of the sounds weren't normal. It started with footsteps. I'd be sitting in the front room, working on my laptop by the fire, when I'd hear them slow, deliberate footsteps moving back and forth across the ceiling above me. The first time it happened, I assumed it was just the house settling, but the rhythm was too regular, too purposeful. It sounded exactly like someone pacing. On the fifth night, I decided to investigate. I crept upstairs with my phone's flashlight, even though the lights worked perfectly well. Something about using the overhead lights felt wrong, like I'd be announcing my presence to whatever was making the noise. Both bedrooms were empty, of course. I was sleeping in the smaller back bedroom and the front bedroom. The one directly above where I'd been sitting showed no signs of disturbance. The floorboards didn't even creak when I walked across them myself. I was about to go back downstairs when I heard it again. The pacing. But this time it was coming from below me. I stood frozen at the top of the stairs, listening to the sound of footsteps moving back and forth across the sitting room floor. The same rhythm, the same deliberate pace I'd been hearing from downstairs, but I was upstairs now, and there was definitely no one in the sitting room. The footsteps stopped. I waited, barely breathing, for several minutes. Then I heard my laptop chime with an email notification from the sitting room below. When I finally worked up the courage to go back downstairs, everything was exactly as I'd left it. My laptop was open on the coffee table, my notes scattered around it. The fire was burning low, but steadily. The email was just spam about insurance, but the room felt different. It felt watched. I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak and whisper of the old house made me lie rigid in bed, straining to listen. Around 3 in the morning, I heard the footsteps again, but this time they seemed to be moving up and down the stairs. A slow, measured tread that paused at the top landing before starting again. The next morning, I called Carlos. "Ah, yes, the old house noises," he said when I described what I'd been hearing. "They all do that, these old places. Nothing to worry about." "But Carlos, it sounds like someone walking around. Really walking around." There was a pause. Is it bothering your work? Well, no, but then is no problem. Old houses, they have personality. You just need to get used to it. Has anyone else complained about this? Another pause, longer this time. Previous tenants, they were not writers. They did not understand atmosphere. That afternoon, I decided to do some research. I drove into the village and asked the shopkeeper about the history of the cottage. Been in the Whitmore family for generations until the last one died about 10 years ago. Eleanor Whitmore, lovely woman. Bit eccentric, but lovely. What happened to her? Found at the bottom of the stairs, poor thing. Doctor said her heart gave out, but she shrugged. House has been empty ever since. Family couldn't sell it, what with the stories. What stories? But she'd already turned away again, and this time when I pressed her, she just shook her head and muttered something about, "Not my place to say." I tried the pub next. The locals were friendlier after a couple of pints and more talkative. "The Whitmore place," said an old man who introduced himself as Tom. Eleanor was convinced it was haunted. Poor woman. Used to come in here talking about voices, footsteps, all sorts. We thought it was just the loneliness, living all alone in that big house. But then she started talking about the ghost asking her to come downstairs. Said it would call her name in the night, asking her to come down to the sitting room. She'd find the fire lit when she hadn't lit it. Furniture moved around. Tom shook his head. Furniture moved around. Tom shook his head. Found her at the bottom of the stairs the next week. I felt cold despite the warmth of the pub. What do you think happened? I think, Tom said quietly, that maybe Eleanor wasn't as mad as we thought. And I think maybe that ghost finally got what it wanted. I drove back to the cottage as the sun was setting, my mind racing. Everything I'd experienced suddenly seemed more sinister. The footsteps, the feeling of being watched, the way the house felt different at night. But I needed the money. I couldn't afford to break the lease over some ghost stories and old house noises. That was my first mistake. I should have left after my conversation with Tom at the pub. Instead, I convinced myself that I was being rational, practical. Ghost stories were just that. Stories were just that. Stories. The cottage was cheap, isolated, and perfect for writing. A few creaky floorboards weren't going to drive me away. The footsteps continued every night, but I began to develop a routine around them. I'd work downstairs until I heard the pacing begin upstairs. Then I'd move to the kitchen to make tea while the ghost, if that's what it was, had its evening constitutional. After 20 minutes or so, the sounds would stop, and I could return to the sitting room. It was almost companionable in a strange way. The ghost seemed to keep regular hours. But on my second week in the cottage, things began to escalate. I first noticed that items were being moved. Small things at first. My pen would be on the other side of the desk when I returned from making tea, or my notebook would be closed when I was certain I'd left it open. I told myself I was being absent-minded, stressed from the isolation and the pressure to finish my novel. Then I started finding the fire lit in the mornings. Every evening I'd carefully bank the coals and close the flue. Every morning I'd come downstairs to find a cheerful blaze crackling away, as if someone had been up since dawn feeding it logs. The first few times, I checked the flue and the dampers, thinking there might be some way for embers to spontaneously ignite. But the fire was always perfectly laid newspaper twisted into spills, kindling arranged just so, logs placed with the expertise of someone who'd been lighting fires their entire life, like Eleanor Whitmore would have done. I called Carlos again. The fire is lighting itself, I told him. He said, and I could hear him thinking, that is unusual. Carlos, fires don't light themselves. Someone would have to. Is anyone else staying there? Any neighbors nearby? No, there isn't. That's why you said it was perfect for a writer. Complete isolation. Yes. Well, maybe his old heating system? Sometimes these old houses, they have strange quirks. But there was no central heating system. The cottage was heated entirely by the fireplace and an old Rayburn in the kitchen. Carlos, I think there might be someone getting into the house at night. I need you to come and check the locks, maybe install some security. No. His voice was sharp, almost panicked. No security systems is not compatible with the house. What do you mean, not compatible? Fine, Google. Look, you have somewhere warm to sleep, yes? And the fire, it is helping with heating costs. Maybe just accept the help. Accept the help. As if having a ghost light my fire was some kind of courtesy service. But Carlos was right about one thing. The cottage was significantly warmer in the mornings than it should have been. My heating bills would be almost nothing if this continued. I decided to test it. That evening, I deliberately left the fireplace cold and empty, not even laying kindling. I took a photo of the bear great with my phone to be absolutely certain. The next morning, the fire was blazing away merrily. Fresh logs, perfectly arranged. Fresh logs, Paul. A small pile of additional firewood had been stacked neatly beside the hearth. what I definitely hadn't brought in from the shed. I checked my phone. The timestamp on my photo showed the empty grate at 11:47 p.m. the night before. I'd woken at 7 in the morning to a fire that had clearly been burning for hours. Something was definitely in the house with me. That's when I decided to look into the village's reputation more thoroughly. I drove to the local library and spent the afternoon researching Pluckley's history. What I found made my blood run cold. Pluckley wasn't just old, it was positively crawling with ghosts. The village held the Guinness World Record for being the most haunted place in Britain, with at least 12 documented spirits. There was the watercress woman who'd burned to death after falling asleep, smoking her pipe, the highwayman who'd been shot while hiding in a tree, the phantom coach and horses that still made regular runs through the village lanes. But it was the entry about the screaming man that really caught my attention. According to local legend, there was a spirit known as the Screaming Man who haunted the area around what used to be the old brickworks. The article described him as a malevolent presence who would torment people living alone in isolated houses, gradually driving them to madness or worse. The old brickworks, according to the map in the book, had been located approximately where my cottage now stood. I felt sick. I'd been so focused on the practical benefits of cheap rent and isolation that I'd ignored every warning sign. The locals' reluctance to talk about the cottage. Carlos's odd behavior. The fact that previous tenants didn't stay long. I was living in the epicenter of one of Britain's most haunted areas, in a house where the previous owner had died under mysterious circumstances, being helped by a ghost that was slowly becoming more active and bold. That night, I decided to stay awake and observe. I made a large pot of coffee, armed myself with my phone camera, and settled in to wait. The footsteps began promptly at 11 p.m., but this time they seemed different, more aggressive. Instead of the measured pacing I'd grown used to, it sounded like someone was stomping angrily back and forth upstairs. At midnight, the footsteps stopped, and I heard something that made my skin crawl. Whistling. It was a tune I didn't recognize, something old and melancholy that seemed to drift down from the upstairs landing. The whistling was definitely human. Not the wind through the windows or the sound of settling timber. Someone was upstairs, whistling a sad song in the dark. I grabbed my phone and started recording, creeping toward the staircase. The whistling continued, and I could tell it was coming from the front bedroom, the one directly above the sitting room. Halfway up the stairs, the whistling stopped. I waited, phone still recording, for several minutes. Then I heard my name. "Come down," said a voice from the sitting room below me. A woman's voice, elderly and cultured. "Come down to the fire. It's nice and warm." Spun around, nearly dropping my phone. The sitting room was empty, but the voice had definitely come from there. From there. Clear as day, as if someone was standing right beside the fireplace. "Come down," the voice repeated. "Don't make me wait." This was what had happened to Eleanor Whitmore, the ghost calling her name, asking her to come downstairs. And she'd been found dead at the bottom of the stairs. I backed up the remaining steps, my heart hammering. "No," I said aloud, my voice shaking. "I'm not coming down." The temperature in the house plummeted. I could see my breath in sudden clouds, and frost began forming on the windows despite the October weather being mild. From downstairs came the sound of furniture being dragged across the floor, heavy, wooden furniture scraping against stone. Then the crash of something large being overturned. No. I ran to the front bedroom window and looked down at my car. I could make it if I ran, just grab my keys and get out, but my keys were downstairs. On the kitchen counter, next to my wallet and phone charger. "Come down," the voice called again, and this time it sounded angry. "Come down now. Now. Say sounded angry. I spent the rest of the night barricaded in the back bedroom. listening to the ghosts systematically destroying the ground floor of the cottage. Furniture crashed, dishes smashed, doors slammed with such force that the entire house shook. And through it all, that elderly woman's voice calling my name, demanding that I come downstairs. When dawn finally broke, the house fell silent. I waited another hour before I dared to venture downstairs. What I found defied explanation. The sitting room was exactly as I'd left it. Every piece of furniture in its proper place, every book on the shelf where it belonged. The fire was burning cheerfully in the grate, and my laptop was open on the coffee table with a new document displayed on the screen. Someone had been typing on my computer. The document contained a single line, repeated over and over for pages. Come down, come down, come down, come down, come down. I grabbed my keys and ran. I spent that day in a hotel in Canterbury, trying to make sense of what was happening. The rational part of my mind insisted that I was having some kind of breakdown. The stress of unemployment, the isolation, the old house playing tricks with my perception. But I had the recording on my phone. I had the mysterious document on my laptop. I had proof that something impossible was happening. I called Carlos from the hotel. I need to break the lease, I told him. There's something wrong with that house, something dangerous. Nah, he said, and I could hear him sipping something. Tea, maybe, or coffee. You met her then. Met who? Fine, get who? Eleanor. She is still there, you see, still wanting company. My blood went cold. You knew about this. You knew there was a ghost in the house and you didn't tell me? I thought maybe she would like you. Writers, you know, they understand loneliness. Eleanor, she was very lonely when she died. Carlos, she's trying to kill me, just like she did before. There was a long pause. Eleanor did not kill herself, he said finally. She was called his different thing. Called by what? By the others, the ones who were there before her. Pluckily, it has many ghosts, yes. Yes? But the old brickworks where your cottage sits, that place has something else, something that collects. I felt sick. Collects what? Lonely people, isolated people. It calls them down and they join the others. Eleanor was called and now she calls for the next one. The next one being me. Is possible. But maybe you are stronger than Eleanor, yes? Maybe you resist the calling. I wanted to scream. Why didn't you tell me this before I moved in? Because no one stays, Carlos said simply. It has been empty for 10 years. I need someone in the house or the local council, they will condemn it. Then where will Eleanor go? Where will any of them go? I don't care where they go. I'm not dying for your ghost collection. I hung up and sat on a hotel bed shaking. I should pack up and leave Kent entirely. Entirely. Mike entirely. Find somewhere else to finish my novel. Somewhere that didn't come with a guarantee of supernatural harassment. But I'd already paid for the month, and my savings were almost gone. I couldn't afford another deposit on a new place, couldn't afford to keep paying for hotel rooms. And there was something else, something I didn't want to admit even to myself. I was curious. In all the stories I'd read online, the creepypastas and Reddit horror threads that had inspired me to try writing in the first place, the protagonists always fled at the first sign of supernatural activity. They packed up and left, and the story ended with warnings about places to avoid. But what if someone stayed? What if someone was strong enough to resist the calling and document what really happened in these places? It would make incredible material for my novel. That evening, I drove back to the cottage. I'd spent the afternoon in Canterbury's bookshops, buying everything I could find about ghost lore and protective rituals. Knee iron was supposed to repel spirits, so I'd bought iron nails to place around the windows and doors. Salt could create barriers that ghosts couldn't cross. Holy water might help, though I'd had to settle for regular water and a prayer, having no idea how to acquire properly blessed water on short notice. I'd also bought the largest, brightest camping lantern I could find. If I was going to face down a ghost, I wanted to be able to see it clearly. The cottage looked peaceful in the evening light, almost welcoming. The diamond-paned windows gleamed warmly, and smoke was already rising from the chimney despite the fact that I'd left the fire completely cold. Eleanor was home. I let myself in with my key, my bag of protective supplies heavy on my shoulder. The sitting room was exactly as I'd left it, which is to say, exactly as it had been before Eleanor's tantrum the night before. My laptop was closed on the coffee table, and the fire was burning with that same expert arrangement of logs. "Hello, Eleanor," I said aloud. The house fell absolutely silent. Even the fire seemed to stop crackling. "I know you're here. I know what you want." But I'm not Eleanor, and I'm not going to just give up and let you call me downstairs. I began placing iron nails around the room, starting with the windows and working my way towards the doors. As I hammered each nail into the window frame, the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. "I know you died here," I continued, moving to the next window. "I know you fell down the stairs, and I know it wasn't an accident. Something called you down, just like you're trying to call me." The fire went out with a sharp hiss, as if someone had thrown water on it. "But I'm not lonely like you were. I'm not isolated. People know where I am." This was a lie. I hadn't told anyone about the cottage except my sister, and I'd only given her Carlos's number. But Eleanor didn't know that. I finished with the windows and moved to the doorway leading to the kitchen. As I raised the hammer to drive a nail into the door frame, it was yanked from my hand with enough force to send me stumbling backwards. The hammer flew across the room and struck the far wall, the crash that seemed impossibly loud. "No," said Eleanor's voice, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "No iron, no barriers." The nails I'd already placed began to heat up, glowing red-hot in the wooden window frames. The smell of burning wood filled the air. I grabbed the bag of salt and began pouring it in a circle around myself, but as soon as the salt hit the floor, it scattered as if blown by a powerful wind. "Come down," Eleanor said, and her voice was closer now, right beside my ear. "Come down to the basement. It's nice and warm down there." Basement? The cottage didn't have a basement. I'd looked at every room when Carlos had shown me around. But as Eleanor spoke, I became aware of a door I hadn't noticed before. It was tucked away beside the fireplace, painted the same color as the wall so that it nearly disappeared. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see stone steps leading down into darkness. That door hadn't been there before. I was certain of it. "Come down," Eleanor's voice whispered, and I felt an almost irresistible urge to walk towards the door. Everyone's waiting. The camping lantern in my hands switched on by itself, its bright lead beam cutting through the sitting room and illuminating the mysterious doorway. In the harsh white light, I could see that the door was very old, older than the cottage itself. The wood was black with age and carved with symbols I didn't recognize. "I can show you," Eleanor continued, her voice warm and grandmotherly now. "I can show you where they all went. All the lonely ones, all the ones who answered the calling." My feet began moving towards the door without my conscious decision. Step by step, as if I was sleepwalking, I found myself approaching the threshold. "That's it," Eleanor crooned. "Just a few more steps. It's so much warmer down here, so much less lonely." I was at the doorway now, lantern beams shining down the stone steps. The stairs were worn smooth by countless feet, and they descended much further than they should have been able to given the cottage's foundation. "Come down," said another voice, a man this time, younger than Eleanor. "Come down and join us." "Come down," said a third voice, and a fourth, and a fifth, a chorus of voices, all calling from the darkness below, all of them welcoming, all of them promising warmth and companionship and an end to loneliness. I took a step down. Nian. The stone was ice cold beneath my foot, even through my shoe. The temperature difference was so sharp that it cleared my head like a slap. This was what had happened to Eleanor. This was what had happened to all the others. The calling wasn't just Eleanor. It was something much older, something that had been collecting the lonely and the isolated for far longer than the cottage had existed. I jerked my foot back and stumbled away from the doorway. No! The voices rose in anger, no longer warm and welcoming. Come back. Come down. I ran for the front door, but it wouldn't open. The handle turned, but the door remained firmly closed, as if it had been sealed shut. The voices from the basement were getting louder, more desperate. Come down now, now. I could hear footsteps on the stone stairs. Not one person, but many, climbing up from whatever lay beneath the cottage. The windows. I ran to the sitting room window and tried to open it. But the iron nails I'd driven into the frame had melted and fused the window shut. The footsteps were at the top of the basement stairs now. In desperation, I grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from the mantelpiece and smashed it through the window. Glass scattered across the garden outside, and cold night air rushed in. I threw my lantern through the broken window and climbed out after it, cutting my hands on the remaining glass, but not caring. Behind me, I could hear the voices calling my name, begging me to come back, promising that it would only hurt for a moment. I ran to my car and drove away without looking back. But as I reached the end of the lane, I made the mistake of checking my rearview mirror. The cottage was blazing with light, every window glowing warmly, smoke rising cheerfully from the chimney. It looked cozy and welcoming, like the perfect place for a writer to finish his novel. And standing in the broken sitting room window, clearly visible in the lamplight, was the figure of an elderly woman. She raised her hand and waved at me, as if we were old friends saying goodbye after a pleasant visit. That was 3 months ago. I'm writing this from a flat in London now. Expensive, cramped, and wonderful in its lack of supernatural activity. I never heard from Carlos again, though I did see the cottage listed for rent again last week. Same price, same description. Beautiful cottage, very private. Perfect for writer. I wonder who answered the ad. I wonder if they're stronger than Eleanor was, stronger than I was. I wonder if they'll come down when the voices start calling. Because I know now that the calling never really stops. Even here in London, in my overpriced flat surrounded by neighbors and traffic and all the noise of city life, I sometimes hear it in the quiet moments before sleep. Come down, Eleanor whispers in my dreams. Come back and finish your story. And the terrifying thing is, part of me wants to. Part of me wants to drive back to Kent, to walk through that front door one more time, to see what's really waiting at the bottom of those stone stairs. But I'm not going back. I'm not going to answer the calling. At least, I don't think I am. The cottage is still available for rent. If anyone's interested, just contact Carlos. He'll give you a very good price. But whatever you do, don't go down to the basement. And if you hear Eleanor calling your name in the night, don't listen. Don't ever listen. Don't ever listen. Don't ever listen. This happened in 2003 up in the Adirondacks, near a lake that no one goes near anymore. Now, if you're thinking this sounds like the start of some campfire tale, just know I've got no time for that nonsense. My life is pretty ordinary, but I guess I do get a little stir-crazy. Maybe that's why I agreed to a last-minute hiking trip with my friend Alex and my younger cousin Tate. I should have known that nothing good ever comes from these spontaneous adventures. The call came on a Thursday evening in late September. I was sitting in my apartment in Albany, staring at the same 4 walls I'd been looking at for months, when my phone rang. Alex's voice crackled through with that familiar edge of excitement that usually meant trouble. "Carson, you busy this weekend?" he asked, not waiting for an answer. I found something incredible. I knew better than to encourage him, but the restlessness that had been eating at me for weeks made me curious despite myself. What kind of something? A lake. Raven's Hollow. It's about 4 hours north, deep in the mountains. I've been researching it for weeks. His voice dropped to that conspiratorial whisper he used when he thought he was onto something big. Carson, the locals won't even talk about it. I mean, they literally change the subject when you bring it up. That should have been warning enough. Alex had a history of chasing ghost stories and urban legends, dragging whoever would listen along for the ride. Usually these adventures ended with us hiking through perfectly normal wilderness, while Alex insisted he could feel the paranormal energy. But there was something different in his voice this time, a genuine unease that I'd never heard before. I already called Tate, he continued. Kid's all in, says he needs the adventure before college starts getting serious. Denning serious. My cousin Tate had just turned 19, fresh out of high school and full of that invincible stupidity that comes with youth. He was a good kid, but like most teenagers, he thought the world was one big playground designed for his entertainment. The idea of him and Alex heading into the wilderness together without supervision made my stomach turn. Alex, you know how I feel about your ghost hunting expeditions. This isn't ghost hunting, he insisted. I don't know what this is. But Carson, I showed the old maps to my buddy at the Geological Survey. He got weird about it. Told me to stay away, wouldn't say why. When's the last time a geologist warned you off a patch of wilderness for non-scientific reasons? I had to admit, that was strange. I'd known Alex since college, and while he was prone to conspiracy theories and supernatural obsessions, he wasn't a liar. If someone at the Geological Survey had warned him off, there might be something to it. Besides, Alex added, playing his ace, when's the last time you did anything interesting? You've been in that apartment so long you're practically growing roots. He wasn't wrong. The past few months had been a blur of routine and dissatisfaction. I've been working the same dead-end job, following the same patterns, feeling like I was slowly disappearing into the background of my own life. The thought of getting out, of breathing real air and feeling actual dirt under my feet was more appealing than I wanted to admit. What exactly do you know about this place? I asked, already feeling myself wavering. It's old, really old. Native American name, but the local tribes don't claim it. There are stories going back to the 1800s about people disappearing near the lake. Hunters, trappers, even a few families that were never found. The thing is, Carson, it's not just people going missing. It's the way they go missing. What do you mean? I mean, sometimes they find the camps perfectly intact, like people just vanished mid-activity. Other times they find evidence of something else, something that doesn't make sense. I could hear Alex shuffling papers on his end, probably spreading out the research he'd compiled. He was nothing if not thorough when something caught his interest. Look, I know how this sounds, he said, but I've been having dreams about this place. The same dream every night for 2 weeks. I see this lake, black as oil, surrounded by trees that look like they're leaning in to whisper secrets, and there's something watching from the other side. That gave me pause. Alex was prone to excitement and exaggeration, but he wasn't mystical. He didn't believe in prophetic dreams or supernatural visions. For him to admit to something like that meant it was really getting to him. I need to go, Carson. I need to see what's there. But I'm not stupid enough to go alone. And I'm not taking Tate without someone sensible along. Can't take someone sensible along. The flattery was obvious, but it worked. I found myself thinking about the weekend stretching ahead, empty and predictable. I thought about Tate, enthusiastic and unprepared, following Alex into whatever trouble he might find. And despite every rational instinct telling me to stay home, I heard myself saying yes. Fine, but we do this smart. Good equipment, detailed route plan, and we tell people where we're going. Already handled, Alex said, and I could hear the grin in his voice. I'll pick you up Friday night. We'll drive up, camp at the trailhead, and hike in Saturday morning. It's only about 8 miles to the lake. After I hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my apartment, wondering what I'd just agreed to. Outside, Albany hummed with its usual urban noise, but for some reason, it felt more distant than usual, like I was already halfway to wherever Alex wanted to take us. I spent the evening digging through my camping gear, checking and rechecking equipment I hadn't used in months. Everything seemed in order, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was forgetting something important. Something that might matter more than I realized. That night, I dreamed of dark water and watching eyes, and woke with the strange certainty that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't possibly understand. Friday evening brought Alex to my door with his usual manic energy and a truck loaded with enough gear for a month-long expedition. Tate sat in the passenger seat, grinning with that infectious enthusiasm that made him impossible to discourage, even when you knew you should try. Uncle Carson, he called out, using the childhood nickname that made me feel ancient at 32. This is going to be epic. This is going to be epic. Alex had spread maps across his dashboard, marked with highlighter and covered in his cramped handwriting. As we drove north, he explained his research with the dedication of a doctoral candidate defending his thesis. The lake sits in a depression that doesn't match the surrounding geology, he said, consulting his notes while navigating the increasingly narrow mountain roads. It's almost perfectly circular, about 200 yards across, and the locals claim it's impossibly deep. No one's ever found the bottom. Maybe because no one's ever tried very hard, I suggested, but Alex shook his head. They have tried. State Environmental Survey attempted a depth study in 1987. Their equipment malfunctioned, every piece of it, all at once. Sonar, depth charges, even simple weighted lines. Nothing worked. Tate leaned forward from the back seat, clearly hooked. What do you think caused it? That's what we're going to find out, Alex said with the confidence of someone who'd never encountered a problem he couldn't solve through persistence and stubbornness. We drove deeper into the mountains as the sun set, the familiar comfort of civilization falling away mile by mile by mile. The radio stations faded to static, then disappeared entirely. Cell phone coverage vanished somewhere around a town called Whitehall, leaving us truly isolated for the first time in recent memory. The roads grew rougher, winding through dense forests that seemed to press closer to the pavement with each passing hour. Ancient pines and maples formed a canopy so thick that even in daylight it would feel like perpetual dusk. Now, with full darkness fallen, our headlights carved a narrow tunnel through walls of black trees. How much further? I asked around 11 o'clock, starting to regret the whole enterprise. About 20 minutes to the trailhead, Alex replied, consulting a GPS unit that showed nothing but green wilderness in all directions. The parking area is just an old logging road, but it'll get us within 8 miles of the lake. Those 20 minutes stretched into 40 as we navigated increasingly primitive roads, some barely wide enough for Alex's truck. Twice we had to stop and move fallen branches, and once Alex had to back up nearly a quarter mile to navigate around a washout that looked recent. When's the last time anyone actually drove back here? Tate asked, voicing what we were all thinking. According to the Forest Service, this road gets maybe a dozen vehicles a year, Alex admitted. Mostly hunters during deer season, and even then, not many. Finally, we reached what could generously be called a parking area, a small clearing where the road simply ended, surrounded by trees so tall they disappeared into the darkness above. Alex cut the engine, and suddenly we were surrounded by the kind of silence that makes city dwellers uncomfortable. No traffic, no machinery, no human sounds at all, just the whisper of wind through branches and the distant call of some night bird I couldn't identify. We set up camp quickly and efficiently, 3 experienced outdoorsmen who'd done this enough times to work without much discussion. But there was something off about the process, a tension that had nothing to do with normal pre-adventure nerves. You guys notice how quiet it is? Tate asked as we arranged our sleeping bags around a small fire. He was right. The silence was oppressive, almost unnatural. Even in remote wilderness, you usually hear something. Insects, small animals moving through the underbrush, the rustle of leaves. Here, there was nothing but our own breathing and the occasional pop of burning wood. Probably just the altitude, Alex said, but he didn't sound convinced. We're pretty high up here. I checked my altimeter, 3,800 feet. High for the Adirondacks, but not enough to explain the absolute stillness surrounding us. We tried to maintain normal conversation around the fire, sharing plans for the next day and speculating about what we might find at the lake, but the words felt hollow, swallowed by the pressing darkness beyond our small circle of light. More than once, I caught myself straining to hear something, anything, that might break the suffocating quiet. My grandfather used to tell stories about places like this. Tate said around midnight, staring into the flames. Places where the spirits got confused, where they couldn't find their way to whatever comes next. Your grandfather was Cherokee, not local, I pointed out, but Tate shrugged. He said some places collect lost things, lost spirits, lost people, lost time. Said you could tell these places by the silence. Alex laughed, but it sounded forced. Good thing we're not lost spirits then. I drew the midnight to 3 shift and spent it feeding the fire and listening to the absolute nothing that surrounded our camp. Twice I was certain I heard footsteps circling us just beyond the firelight, but when I grabbed my flashlight and swept the perimeter, I found only trees and shadows. At one point, around 2:30, the fire suddenly dimmed as if something had passed between it and the oxygen it needed. The flames flickered and danced in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate, like they were responding to some unseen presence. I added more wood and stirred the coals, but the dancing continued for several minutes before finally returning to normal. When Alex relieved me at 3, I was grateful to crawl into my sleeping bag and try to find some rest. But sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of watching eyes and whispered warnings in languages I didn't understand. Dawn brought little relief. The oppressive silence continued, and our breakfast conversation was subdued, as if speaking too loudly might wake something better left sleeping. We broke camp efficiently, shouldering our packs and consulting Alex's maps one final time. 8 miles northeast, he said, pointing toward a gap in the trees that might once have been a trail. Should take us about 4 hours at a steady pace. And if we don't find anything... Alex grinned, but there was something strained about it. Then we'll have had a nice hike in beautiful country. As we headed into the trees, I looked back once at our campsite. The fire pit was cold and clean, our tire tracks already fading in the soft earth. In a few days, there would be no sign we'd ever been there at all. Somehow, that thought was more unsettling than it should have been. The hike to Raven's Hollow began innocently enough. Alex led us along what might once have been a game trail, winding through dense forest that grew thicker and more oppressive with each mile. The trees here were older than anything I'd seen in other parts of the Adirondacks, their trunks massive and gnarled, their branches forming such a tight canopy that even at midday, we walked in perpetual twilight. For the first few hours, we maintained the casual banter typical of a hiking trip. Tate regaled us with stories from his first semester at college. Alex pontificated about various conspiracy theories, and I tried to shake the unease that had been building since we'd arrived at the trailhead. So, head. But as we went deeper, our conversation gradually died away. There was something about this forest that discouraged speech, as if the very air was too thick to carry casual words. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a presence unto itself, pressing against us with almost physical weight. "The trees are wrong," Tate said suddenly, stopping in the middle of what he'd been saying about his economics professor. Alex and I both looked around, trying to see what he meant. At first glance, the forest looked like any other: pine, maple, oak, the usual northeastern mix. But as I studied it more carefully, I began to understand what Tate had noticed. The trees were leaning. Not dramatically, not in any way that would immediately catch your attention, but subtly, consistently, all in the same direction, as if they were all turning towards something, listening to some call we couldn't hear. Probably just the prevailing wind patterns, Alex said, but his voice lacked conviction. "What wind?" Tate asked. He was right. We hadn't felt so much as a breeze since entering the forest. We pressed on, but now I found myself studying the vegetation more carefully. The deeper we went, the more obvious it became that something was affecting the normal growth patterns. Branches twisted in unnatural spirals, roots emerged from the ground at odd angles, and everywhere there was this subtle sense of vegetation straining towards some distant focal point. Get this. Around noon, we stopped for lunch in a small clearing where a massive oak had fallen, creating the first real open space we'd seen in hours. The sudden exposure to actual daylight was both relief and revelation. We were all squinting like cave dwellers, and I realized how thoroughly the forest had isolated us from the normal world. "How much further?" I asked, consulting my own map and GPS. "Maybe 2 miles, Alex replied, but he was frowning at his instruments. "This is weird. My GPS keeps jumping around. Says we're here, then half a mile east, then back here again." I checked mine and found the same problem. The readings were unstable, shifting constantly in a way that suggested either equipment failure or some kind of interference. Magnetic anomaly. Tate suggested he was majoring in geology and liked to show off his knowledge. "Maybe," Alex said, but he was studying his compass, which seemed to be spinning slowly, unable to find magnetic north. We finished lunch in uncomfortable silence, each of us dealing with the growing certainty that we were in a place that didn't follow normal rules. The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be scientific explanations for everything we were experiencing, but that voice was getting quieter by the hour. The final approach to Raven's Hollow was the worst part of the hike. The trail, such as it was, began to descend through terrain that felt fundamentally wrong. The slope was too steep, the trees too close together, the ground too soft beneath our feet. More than once, I had the sensation that we were walking on something that wasn't quite solid, as if the earth here was somehow less substantial than it should be. And then, without warning, we emerged from the tree line and saw the lake. Raven's Hollow was exactly as Alex had described it. A perfect circle of black water surrounded by a ring of pines that leaned inward like conspirators sharing secrets. The lake was maybe 200 yards across, its surface so still it looked like polished obsidian. There was no beach, no gradual slope into the water. The forest simply ended at the edge, and the lake began. But what Alex hadn't conveyed, what no description could have prepared us for, was the sense of presence that radiated from the water. This wasn't just a remote mountain lake. This was something alive, something aware, something that had been waiting for us. "Jesus," Tate whispered. "Look at it." We stood at the tree line for several minutes, none of us eager to approach the water's edge. The lake exerted a strange pull, drawing our eyes and holding them, But there was nothing welcoming about the invitation. It felt more like a trap than a destination. "The smell," Alex said suddenly, and I realized he was right. There was an odor rising from the water, subtle but unmistakable. Decay, stagnation, something organic left too long in darkness. "Maybe we should just take some pictures and head back," I suggested, but I knew even as I said it that Alex wouldn't be satisfied with that. "We came all this way," he said, adjusting his pack and starting toward the water. "Might as well get a closer look." Reluctantly, Tate and I followed. Each step toward the lake felt like walking deeper into some kind of field, as if the air itself was growing thicker and more resistant. By the time we reached the edge, I was breathing hard despite the minimal exertion. Up close, the water was even more unsettling. It was perfectly black, so dark that it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When I crouched down and held my hand just above the surface, I couldn't see any depth at all. It was like looking into a pool of liquid night. "Alex," I said, "I think we should go." But Alex wasn't listening. He was staring across the lake, his face pale and his eyes wide with something that might have been fear or fascination. "Do you see it?" he asked quietly. I followed his gaze and felt my heart stutter. On the far shore, barely visible through the overhanging branches, was a figure. It stood perfectly motionless, tall and thin, its outline blurry against the backdrop of trees. "Is that a person?" Tate asked. But even as he spoke, we all knew it wasn't. The figure was wrong in ways that defied immediate analysis. Too tall, with arms that hung past its knees, its posture was rigid, unnatural, like it was balancing on legs that weren't quite the right length. And though the distance made details impossible to discern, there was something about its stillness that suggested it wasn't alive in any conventional sense. "Maybe it's just a dead tree," I said, but I didn't believe it. Not walking, not stepping, but shifting position in a single jerky motion, like a piece being moved on a game board. It was now facing directly toward us, and though I couldn't make out its features, I felt the weight of its attention like ice water in my veins. "We need to leave," I said, standing up and backing away from the water's edge. "Right now." But Alex was transfixed, staring at the figure with the intensity of a man seeing a miracle or a nightmare. "It's real," he whispered. "It's actually real." The figure raised one impossibly long arm and waved at us. Not a greeting, not a gesture of acknowledgement, but something else entirely. Something that felt like mockery, like a predator playing with prey it knew couldn't escape. That broke the spell. "Shurada!" All three of us turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with panic-fueled clumsiness. Behind us, I heard a sound that might have been laughter, low and cold and utterly inhuman. We didn't stop running until we were well into the forest, gasping and stumbling over roots and rocks. When we finally collapsed against a cluster of birch trees, I looked back toward the lake. But the tree line blocked our view. "What the hell was that?" Tate demanded, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Alex admitted, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely scared. But it waved at us. It knew we were there. "We're leaving," I said firmly. "Now, we pack up and hike back to the truck." "But Carson..." "No." I stood up. My legs stood up. My legs still trembling from the adrenaline. "Whatever that was, we don't belong here. This place is wrong, and we're getting out before something happens." For once, Alex didn't argue. We started back through the forest, moving faster than was safe on the rough terrain. But behind us, carried on air that shouldn't have been moving, I could swear I heard the sound of something following. Something that had learned our scent and had no intention of letting us simply walk away. We hadn't made it half a mile from the lake when we realized we were being followed. It started as a feeling, that primitive awareness that predators are real and you might be prey. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself checking over my shoulder every few steps. Alex had gone quiet, no longer pontificating about paranormal phenomena, and Tate was staying close enough to step on my heels. Then we heard it, the sound of something large moving through the forest behind us, not trying to be quiet, but not exactly making a direct approach either. Branches snapped, leaves rustled, and occasionally there was a wet sliding sound that made my skin crawl. Maybe it's just a bear, Tate suggested, but his voice was tight with fear. Bears don't sound like that, Alex replied, and he was right. Whatever was following us moved wrong, with irregular pauses and sudden bursts of motion that suggested something unnatural about its gait. I stopped and held up my hand, motioning for silence. We all froze, listening intently. For a moment, there was nothing but our own labored breathing. Then, from somewhere behind us and slightly to the left, came a sound that made my blood turn to ice. A low, rhythmic clicking like fingernails tapping against wood. "It's playing with us," Alex whispered. "Hurting us." He was right. Every time we tried to veer off our original path, the sounds would shift, cutting off our intended direction and forcing us back onto the trail that led toward our campsite. Whatever was following us wasn't just pursuing. It was directing our movement with the patience of an experienced hunter. We picked up our pace, trying to maintain the balance between speed and stealth. The clicking continued, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always there. And underneath it, barely audible, was something that might have been breathing, if breathing could sound like wind through a crypt. "There," Tate said suddenly, pointing ahead. "The clearing where we had lunch." The fallen oak was exactly as we'd left it, but now the space felt more like a trap than a rest stop. The trees pressed close on all sides, and the patch of sky visible above seemed impossibly small and distant. "Do we stop?" Alex asked. Before I could answer, the clicking stopped. The forest fell into absolute silence, and somehow that was worse than the pursuit. We stood in the center of the clearing, back to back, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. There, Tate breathed. At the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the shadows between two massive pines, was the figure from the lake. It stood perfectly still, watching us with an intensity that was almost physical. This close, its wrongness was undeniable. It was roughly human-shaped but stretched, as if someone had taken a normal person and pulled them like taffy. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in what looked like clusters of twigs rather than fingers. And its face was smooth, featureless, like a mannequin that had never been finished. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just pale skin stretched tight over angular bone structure. "Don't move," I whispered. But Tate was already backing away. The figure's head tilted slightly, following Tate's movement with predatory focus. Then it stepped forward, and I saw that it wasn't walking so much as gliding, its feet barely touching the ground as it moved with fluid, impossible grace. "Run," I said quietly. "What?" "Run." We bolted across the clearing and into the trees on the far side, crashing through underbrush with desperate abandon. Behind us, I heard that wet sliding sound again, closer now, accompanied by a noise like wind chimes made of bone. The thing was fast. Impossibly fast. No matter how quickly we moved, it seemed to be keeping pace without effort, sometimes appearing between trees ahead of us, sometimes flanking us from the side. It was driving us, hurting us like sheep. And I was beginning to understand that it had a specific destination in mind. "It's not trying to catch us," Alex gasped as we scrambled over a fallen log. "It's leading us somewhere." "Where?" Tate demanded. Before anyone could answer, I stumbled into a spider web and felt the sticky strands cling to my face. But as I wiped them away, I realized they weren't spider webs at all. They were too thick, too strong, and they had an oily quality that made my skin burn where they touched. "Don't touch those," Alex warned, but it was too late. The strands were everywhere now, hanging between trees like some kind of grotesque decoration, and as we pushed deeper into the forest, they grew thicker and more numerous. We're in its territory now, I realized with growing horror. It's been preparing for this. The sticky strands formed an increasingly dense maze, forcing us along a specific path that led deeper into the forest. Every time we tried to deviate, we found ourselves entangled in the viscous web, struggling to break free while that clicking sound grew closer. And then, Tate screamed. I spun around to see him caught in a cluster of the oily strands, fighting to pull free as something pale and elongated reached out from behind a tree. The thing's arm stretched impossibly far, its twig-like fingers brushing against Tate's shoulder. "Get away from him!" I shouted, grabbing the largest branch I could find and swinging it at the figure. The branch passed right through it, as if it wasn't entirely solid. But somehow, impossibly, those finger twigs made contact with Tate's skin, leaving dark marks that spread like ink stains through fabric. Tate cried out in pain and stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder. Where the thing had touched him, his shirt was disintegrating, and underneath, his skin was turning black. "Tate!" Alex grabbed our cousin's other arm, helping to pull him away from the reaching figure, but the thing wasn't done. It glided closer, its featureless face tilting as if examining its handiwork. Then impossibly, a slit appeared where its mouth should be, opening wide to reveal darkness that seemed to extend far deeper than any throat should go. The clicking sound was coming from inside it, I realized. The rhythmic tapping of something moving in the depths of its impossible throat. "Move, move, move!" I pushed Alex and Tate ahead of me, back toward what I hoped was the direction of our camp. We ran blindly through the maze of sticky strands, some part of my mind noting that they seemed to be dissolving now, clearing a path for our escape. The thing was letting us go, but not out of mercy. It was done with us, satisfied with whatever it had accomplished when it touched Tate. By the time we reached our campsite, Tate was barely conscious. The black mark on his shoulder had spread down his arm and across his chest, and his skin felt cold and clammy. Alex helped me get him into the truck while I threw our gear into the back with shaking hands. "Hospital," I said, starting the engine. "Right now." As we pulled away from the trailhead, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw a pale figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching our departure with that eyeless, patient attention. It raised one impossibly long arm in what might have been a farewell wave, or a promise that this wasn't over. The nearest hospital was 2 hours away, and Tate spent most of the drive drifting in and out of delirium. The black mark on his shoulder had stopped spreading, but it pulsed with a rhythm that didn't match his heartbeat, as if something alien was trying to synchronize with his body's natural rhythms. "Cold," he kept mumbling. "So cold." He kept mumbling. "So cold. It's looking for me." Alex and I exchanged worried glances in the front seat. There was no cell phone coverage until we reached the main highway, and even then, how would we explain what had happened? An animal attack. The truth was too bizarre for anyone to believe. The emergency room staff was professional but baffled. The black mark on Tate's shoulder defied easy categorization. It wasn't a bruise, wasn't frostbite, wasn't any kind of trauma they could identify. One doctor suggested some kind of chemical burn, but when they tested the affected area, they found no trace of caustic substances. Has he been exposed to any unusual substances? Dr. Martinez asked, studying the mark with obvious confusion. Fritidizariana, industrial chemicals, exotic plants, anything like that? "We were just hiking," I said, which was true as far as it went. They ran blood tests, took x-rays, even consulted with specialists over the phone. Everything came back normal except for one anomaly. Tate's body temperature kept fluctuating, dropping as low as 94 degrees before slowly climbing back to normal, then dropping again. "It's like something is drawing heat out of him," Dr. Martinez explained. "But we can't find any cause." but we can't find any cause. For 3 days, Tate lay in that hospital bed, mumbling about cold shadows and reaching hands. The marks slowly faded from black to dark green to a sickly yellow, and his fever broke. On the fourth morning, he woke up lucid and confused, with no memory of the encounter at Raven's Hollow, Athialo. I remember hiking to some lake, he said when we visited. But after that, nothing. Did I fall? Hit my head? Alex and I agreed to stick to the story we'd told the hospital staff. Tate had slipped near the water and hit his shoulder on a rock. It was easier than trying to explain what had really happened, and it spared Tate the knowledge of what he'd endured. But privately, Alex and I began to research everything we could find about Raven's Hollow and the surrounding area. What we discovered was disturbing enough to make us both lose sleep. The disappearances went back further than Alex had initially discovered, much further. Records from the early 1800s described hunters and trappers who vanished near the black water that reflects no light. Native American oral histories recorded by early ethnographers spoke of a place where the hungry shadow waited for those foolish enough to venture too close. More recently, we found newspaper clippings from the 1950s describing a search and rescue operation for a family of 4 who had disappeared while camping in the area. They were found 3 days later, alive but changed. Alive but changed. The father spent the rest of his life in a psychiatric facility, babbling about the thing with reaching arms. The mother and children recovered physically but reportedly never spoke of their experience, even to each other. In 1987, the state environmental survey that Alex had mentioned hadn't just experienced equipment failures. According to a report buried in bureaucratic archives, 3 of the 5 survey team members had suffered what were described as psychological episodes requiring immediate evacuation and extended psychiatric care. There's a pattern, Alex said one evening as we pored over our research in my apartment. People encounter this thing, survive, but come back different, damaged. What about the ones who don't come back? Alex pulled out a folder thick with missing person reports. 17 confirmed disappearances in the last 50 years, all within a 5-mile radius of the lake. No bodies ever found. The most unsettling discovery came from a geological survey conducted in the 1970s. According to the report, Raven's Hollow wasn't a natural lake at all. The depression had been formed by some kind of sudden collapse, creating a perfect circle that extended down at least 400 feet before the survey equipment stopped functioning. It's like something fell from the sky, Alex said, studying the topographical maps. Or something emerged from underground. Either way, that lake shouldn't exist. I was about to respond when my phone rang. It was the hospital. Mr. Tall Elk, this is Dr. Martinez. I'm calling about your cousin. You need to come down here right away. We found Tate standing in his hospital room, fully dressed, staring out the window toward the north. His bags were packed, and he had the focused intensity of someone preparing for a journey. I have to go back, he said without turning around. Tate, you just got out of bed. You're still recovering? No, he said quietly. I'm not recovering. I'm changing, and it's calling me back. Dr. Martinez pulled us aside. His vitals are normal, but there's something else. The mark on his shoulder, it's active again. Not visible, but we can detect increased electrical activity in the tissue. It's almost like there's some kind of transmitter under his skin. Transmitter for what? We don't know, but whatever it is, it's getting stronger. That night, Tate walked out of the hospital. Despite security cameras and locked doors, he simply vanished. The footage showed him in his room at midnight, and then the next frame showed an empty bed. No one saw him leave. We found him 3 days later, sitting by the edge of Raven's Hollow, staring into the black water with an expression of peaceful contentment. He looked healthy, normal, except for his eyes. His eyes held the same dark depth as the lake itself. "I've been waiting for you," he said when he saw us approaching. "Tate, come on, let's go home." He smiled, but it wasn't quite his smile. "This is home now. This is home now. It showed me what I really am, what I was always meant to be." "The cold isn't something to fight anymore, Carson. It's something to embrace." He stood up and walked toward the water, and despite our shouts and attempts to restrain him, he simply faded away like morning mist, leaving us alone on the shore of that impossible lake. Mine was 20 years ago. Alex moved to Colorado and refuses to talk about what happened. I stayed in Albany, but I've never gone hiking again. Sometimes, on cold nights when the wind is still, I get phone calls with no one on the other end. Just breathing, slow and patient, like something waiting for me to finally understand. Last month, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph of Raven's Hollow, taken from the same spot where we first saw the figure. But now there were two shapes standing in the shadows across the water, one tall and wrong, reaching toward the camera with those impossible arms. The other was unmistakably Tate, though he looked exactly as he had 20 years ago. He was waving, just as the thing had waved at us on that first day. And on the back of the photograph, written in handwriting I recognized, were 4 words: "Come home soon, Carson." I keep the photograph in my desk drawer, and sometimes I find myself studying it for hours, feeling that familiar pull toward the dark water and whatever waits beneath its surface. Part of me knows I should burn it, should forget everything that happened at Raven's Hollow. But another part of me, a part that grows stronger every day, whispers that Tate is right, that the cold isn't something to fight, that maybe it's time to go home.